Today, we're going to explore 5 chilling true crime cases involving serial offenders, including lust-driven killers and their disturbing patterns behind their crimes. Let's begin with the first one.
Imagine calling the police to confess and they hang up on you. Not once, but multiple times. Because they know you. Because you're their friend. Because you've been sitting in their favorite bar, buying them drinks, chatting about their cases, learning everything about how they hunt criminals. And now you're trying to tell them you've ended the lives of 10 people, including your own mother. This is exactly what happened on April 23rd, 1973, in Pueblo, Colorado. A 6'9" man with an IQ of 145 stood in a phone booth, desperately trying to convince police officers who considered him a buddy that he was one of the most dangerous offenders California had ever seen. Between May 1972 and April 1973, young women began disappearing from the roads around Santa Cruz, California. College students, hitchhikers, someone's daughter, someone's sister. They would leave campus or a friend's house, thumb out, trusting that the next car would get them safely to their destination. But for 6 of them, that car was driven by a friendly, intelligent young man who seemed safe, who had a university parking sticker, who talked about psychology and seemed educated, who smiled warmly and offered helpful conversation. Within hours, they were gone. The remains told a horrifying story. These weren't crimes of passion or rage. These were calculated, methodical acts carried out by someone who understood human psychology, who knew exactly how to appear trustworthy, who had studied law enforcement techniques, and who was getting better with each victim. He kept souvenirs. He revisited scenes. He documented everything in his mind with photographic precision. And perhaps most chilling of all, he was hiding in plain sight, fooling everyone who knew him, including the very detectives hunting for the person responsible. How does a 15-year-old commit his first violent crimes and then walk free to harm again? What creates a mind so methodical that it can separate human beings into parts while maintaining a friendly conversation with police? How does someone attend college classes while actively committing crimes, appearing completely normal to everyone around them? And the question that still echoes today, could this have been prevented? Edmund Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California, into what appeared from the outside to be a typical middle-class American family. His father, Edmund Jr., worked as an electrician, providing a stable income. His mother, Clarnell, was a strong-willed woman with definite ideas about how things should be done. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and Edmund, their only son. But inside the Kemper household, a different reality was taking shape, one that would have devastating consequences not just for this family, but for numerous innocent people in the years to come. The marriage between Edmund Jr. and Clarnell was volatile from the start. They fought frequently, their arguments often centering on how to raise their children, particularly their son. Clarnell was domineering and critical, often belittling young Edmund, mocking his size as he began growing unusually tall at an early age, and according to later accounts from Edmund himself and others who knew the family, creating an environment of constant criticism and emotional turmoil. Nothing Edmund did was ever good enough for his mother. Every achievement was minimized, every failure magnified and thrown back in his face. When Edmund was just 9 years old, his parents divorced. A traumatic event for any child, but particularly difficult given the circumstances. He moved with his mother and 2 sisters to Montana, leaving behind his father and the only home he'd ever known. The divorce, rather than bringing peace, intensified the family dysfunction that had been building for years. In Montana, things went from bad to worse. Clarnell, now a single mother raising 3 children, became increasingly fearful of her son. As Edmund grew taller and larger, she began to see him as a threat. She made a decision that would haunt Edmund for the rest of his life. She forced him to sleep in the basement, locked away from his sisters. She allegedly told him that his sisters needed to be protected from him, that there was something wrong with him, that he couldn't be trusted around them. For a young boy already struggling with feelings of isolation and rejection from his mother, already dealing with the trauma of his parents' divorce, this additional rejection became deeply embedded in his psyche. Night after night, Edmund would be sent down to the cold basement, the door locked from the outside. He would lie there in the darkness, listening to his mother and sisters living their lives upstairs, feeling utterly alone and abandoned. The basement became both his prison and his refuge, a place where his dark thoughts could grow unchecked, where fantasies could develop without interference. The impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Child psychologists now understand that prolonged isolation and rejection during critical developmental years can have severe psychological consequences. Edmund was experiencing not just physical isolation, but emotional abandonment by the very person who was supposed to love and protect him unconditionally. By his early teenage years, Edmund's thoughts had turned increasingly disturbing. The warning signs were clear to anyone who cared to look, though tragically, no one did. He began playing strange games with his sisters, games where he pretended to be executed in a gas chamber, acting out his own demise in disturbing detail. His sisters thought it was just weird behavior from their odd brother, not recognizing it as the cry for help it actually was. He cut the heads off his sisters' dolls, methodically removing them and keeping them separate from the bodies. When questioned about this behavior, he couldn't explain why he did it, only that he felt compelled to do so. The symbolism, obvious in hindsight, went completely unnoticed at the time. Then came the incident with the family cat. Edmund buried the family cat alive in the backyard, an act of cruelty that shocked even his often absent mother. But he didn't stop there. Later, he dug up the cat's remains, removed its head, and mounted it on a stick, keeping it as some kind of trophy. When his mother discovered what he'd done, she was horrified and disgusted. But rather than getting Edmund serious psychological help, she simply punished him and tried to move on. Edmund later admitted in interviews that even at this young age, he had violent fantasies that involved harming others, particularly women. He fantasized about having power over people, about controlling them, about making them do what he wanted. These weren't normal childhood thoughts or typical teenage rebellion. These were the early warning signs of a deeply disturbed mind developing along a dangerous path. At 13, unable to cope with life with his mother any longer, Edmund ran away. He traveled to California to find his father, hoping that Edmund Jr. would take him in, would provide the male guidance and acceptance he so desperately craved. But Edmund Jr., who had remarried and was starting fresh with a new wife and a new life, didn't want his troubled son disrupting things. The rejection by his father, the one person Edmund had hoped would save him from his mother, was perhaps even more devastating than his mother's treatment. Edmund Jr. refused to let his son stay, and instead sent Edmund to live with his own parents, Edmund's paternal grandparents, Maud and Edmund Sr., on their remote ranch in North Fork, California. The ranch in North Fork was isolated, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by wilderness. For most teenagers, this might have been an adventure, a chance to learn about ranch life and enjoy the outdoors. For Edmund, already troubled and now feeling rejected by both parents, it became another form of imprisonment. His grandmother Maud was a stern woman who ran the household with strict rules and high expectations. She had little patience for Edmund's moody behavior and adolescent difficulties. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., was a distant figure who spent most of his time working on the ranch, leaving discipline and daily interaction to his wife. Edmund felt increasingly isolated and angry. He had no friends his age, no social outlets, no one to talk to about the dark thoughts that consumed him. He spent hours alone, walking the property, thinking, planning, fantasizing. The ranch had firearms, necessary tools for rural life, and Edmund became familiar with them, learning to shoot, learning to handle weapons with increasing confidence. The isolation gave him time to think, but it also gave his darkest thoughts room to grow unchecked. He felt trapped, unwanted by his parents, controlled by his grandmother, ignored by his grandfather. The anger and resentment built day by day, week by week, until it felt like a pressure that had to be released somehow. On this late summer day, 15-year-old Edmund was at the ranch with his grandparents. His grandfather had plans to go into town for groceries, a routine trip that usually took a couple of hours. Edmund would be left alone with his grandmother, something that had happened many times before without incident. But on this day, something was different. An argument erupted between Edmund and Maud at the kitchen table. The exact trigger for the argument has been disputed over the years. Edmund later claimed his grandmother was nagging him about his chores, criticizing him the way his mother always had, and something inside him simply snapped. He went to where the rifles were kept and retrieved a .22 caliber rifle. He returned to the kitchen where his grandmother was still sitting at the table. Without warning, without giving her a chance to defend herself or even understand what was happening, Edmund ended her life, shooting her in the head and back. Maud Kemper, a woman who had taken in her troubled grandson trying to help him, died in her own kitchen at his hands. But Edmund's actions that day weren't finished. He knew his grandfather would return soon from the grocery store. He could have run, could have called for help, could have done anything else. Instead, he made a calculated decision. He waited. When he heard his grandfather's car approaching, Edmund went outside and met him in the driveway. As Edmund Sr. got out of the car, probably ready to greet his grandson and ask him to help bring in the groceries, Edmund ended his life as well. Two people who had tried to help him, who had taken him in when his own parents wouldn't, were now gone. Then Edmund did something that would become a pattern in his later crimes. He called for help. He didn't run or try to hide what he'd done. Instead, he phoned his mother in Montana and told her what had happened. Clarnell, despite her complicated relationship with her son, told him to call the police immediately. When officers arrived at the remote ranch, they found Edmund waiting calmly. He explained what he'd done in a matter-of-fact tone that disturbed the responding officers. When asked why he had ended his grandparents' lives, his response was chilling in its honesty. "I just wondered how it would feel to take someone's life." Later, he would add that he had taken his grandmother's life because he was angry at her, and his grandfather's life because he knew the older man would be upset about his wife. Edmund was arrested and charged as a juvenile. Given the severity of the crimes and his age, he was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for mentally ill offenders. Psychiatrists who examined him diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, a serious mental illness that, in their assessment, required long-term treatment and confinement. At Atascadero, Edmund was supposed to receive treatment and remain until he was deemed safe for release. But here's what should concern everyone about this case. Edmund was brilliant. With an IQ measured at 145, placing him in the genius range, he was smarter than most of his doctors, smarter than most of the staff, and he quickly learned how to use that intelligence to manipulate the system designed to contain him. He studied psychology voraciously, reading every book he could get his hands on. He memorized the psychological tests that psychiatrists would give him, learning the right answers that would indicate rehabilitation and mental health improvement. He learned exactly what to say, how to act, what emotions to display to convince evaluators that he was making progress. More disturbingly, he was actually allowed to help administer psychological tests to other patients. This gave him insider knowledge of how the tests worked, what responses indicated what diagnoses, and how to game the entire system. It was like teaching a bank robber how the vault worked, and then expecting him not to use that knowledge. Edmund was charismatic and intelligent, and he befriended staff members, making himself useful, becoming a model patient. Staff began to see him as helpful, cooperative, even likable. The monster who had ended 2 lives at age 15 gradually became, in their eyes, a rehabilitated young man who had made a terrible mistake but learned from it. Some psychiatrists, particularly those who had worked with Edmund longest and knew his case best, objected to his release. They argued that he remained dangerous, that his cooperation was manipulation rather than genuine change, that releasing him would be a tragic mistake, but their objections were overruled. In 1969, at age 21, after serving just 5 years for ending the lives of 2 people, Edmund Emil Kemper III was released on parole. The system that was supposed to protect society from dangerous individuals had failed its first major test. Despite the strong objections from psychiatrists who knew him best, despite his history of violence, despite every warning sign, Edmund was released on parole. And in a decision that defies all logic and understanding, he was sent to live with the one person who had contributed most to his psychological problems, his mother, Clarnell. Clarnell was now living in Santa Cruz, California, working as an administrative assistant at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The university was growing rapidly, attracting students from across California and beyond, creating a vibrant campus community. Young people, particularly young women, were everywhere in Santa Cruz, hitchhiking between campus and town, trusting in the general safety of their college community. The same toxic relationship between Edmund and his mother resumed immediately. She criticized him constantly, belittled his attempts to find work and build a life, reminded him of his failures and his time at Atascadero. The humiliation and rage he'd felt as a child came flooding back. But now, he was a full-grown man, standing 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds. Edmund desperately wanted to become a highway patrol officer. He'd been fascinated by law enforcement since childhood, studied police procedures extensively, and believed he could be good at the work. But his dreams crashed against reality. At his height and weight, he exceeded the physical requirements for the California Highway Patrol. They rejected his application, and this rejection stung deeply. Here was a young man who had studied law enforcement, who knew police procedures better than many officers, who desperately wanted to be part of that world, and he was being told he didn't measure up because he was too tall. The rejection felt like yet another person telling him he wasn't good enough, wasn't acceptable, didn't fit in. Infiltrating the police world, 1970 to 1972. But Edmund found another way into the world of law enforcement. He began frequenting a bar called the Jury Room, a popular hangout for local police officers and sheriff's deputies. His size made him memorable, his intelligence made him interesting, and his genuine interest in police work made him popular with the law enforcement crowd. Officers began to know him by name. They'd save him a seat at the bar. They'd include him in their conversations about cases they were working on, techniques they were using, challenges they were facing. Edmund would buy rounds of drinks, ask thoughtful questions, offer insights drawn from his extensive reading about criminology and police procedure. What these officers didn't know, couldn't possibly have known given that his juvenile records were sealed, was that they were befriending someone who had already ended 2 lives. They were sharing investigation techniques with someone who would use that knowledge to avoid detection. They were, unknowingly, training the very person who would soon become one of California's most dangerous offenders. Edmund absorbed everything. He learned about forensic evidence and how police collected it. He learned about investigation procedures and common mistakes criminals made. He learned about what made cases difficult to solve and what helped solve them quickly. Every piece of information was filed away in his exceptional memory, ready to be used when the time came. In 1972, Edmund took several significant steps toward preparing for what was to come. He purchased a motorcycle, which he rode extensively around the Santa Cruz area. This allowed him to familiarize himself with remote roads, isolated areas, places where someone could go unseen and unheard. The motorcycle was later involved in an accident that, while injurious to Edmund, entitled him to a $15,000 insurance settlement. This was a substantial amount of money in 1972, equivalent to roughly $100,000 today. Edmund used this money to purchase a car that would become infamous in the annals of true crime, a tan 1969 Ford Galaxy. But this wasn't just any car purchase. Edmund modified the vehicle to suit his purposes. He installed a secondary lock on the passenger side that could only be opened from the outside, effectively trapping anyone who sat in that seat. He kept weapons in the vehicle, hidden but readily accessible. He made sure the car was clean, presentable, trustworthy looking. Around the same time, Edmund successfully petitioned to have his juvenile record sealed. This meant that his history at Atascadero, his diagnoses, his violent past, all of it disappeared from official view. Anyone doing a background check would see a clean record. He also passed a psychiatric evaluation, with evaluators declaring him no longer a threat. Officially, on paper, Edmund Emil Kemper III was a normal young man with no criminal history, no mental health concerns, no reason for anyone to be wary of him. In reality, he was a carefully preparing predator who was about to embark on a crime spree that would terrorize an entire community. Edmund also began taking classes at a local community college, studying subjects that interested him and further establishing his cover as a normal young man trying to better himself. He worked odd jobs, maintained a regular routine, and appeared to everyone who knew him as a somewhat awkward but harmless young man still living with his mother and trying to find his way in life. But in private, Edmund was studying. He was watching. He paid attention to the young women who hitchhiked around the university area. He noted their patterns, their routines, the times when they were most likely to be looking for rides. He studied their psychology, understanding that they would be more likely to trust someone who appeared educated, who had a university parking sticker, who talked about familiar topics. He was methodical in his planning. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse that he was preparing for. This was calculated, patient, carefully thought out. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He just needed to wait for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right victim. On this spring day, the kind of perfect California afternoon that makes people believe the world is a safe and beautiful place, two 18-year-old friends from Fresno State College, Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchesa, were hitchhiking from Berkeley back to Fresno. They'd been visiting friends in the Bay Area and needed to get home. Hitchhiking was common, almost expected among college students in 1972. It was economical, it was an adventure, and in the general culture of the early 1970s, it seemed safe enough. Edmund picked them up on the highway in his Ford Galaxy. To Marianne and Anita, he seemed like the perfect ride. He was going their direction. He was clean-cut and presentable. He spoke intelligently about college life and seemed safe, even friendly. They got into the car without hesitation, probably feeling lucky to have found such a good ride so quickly. Edmund drove them away from the highway, telling them he knew a shortcut or needed to make a quick stop. The young women, trusting and unsuspecting, didn't object. He drove them to a remote, isolated area where no one would see, no one would hear, no one would interrupt what he had planned. What happened next demonstrated the calculated, methodical nature of Edmund's crimes. This wasn't a sudden act of violence or a crime of opportunity that got out of control. Edmund had planned this, prepared for it, thought through every step. He ended the lives of both young women in that remote location. But he didn't stop there. Edmund drove their bodies back to his apartment in Alameda, where he was living separately from his mother at the time. He waited until he knew he would be alone, then brought the victims inside. What he did to their remains over the following hours showed his complete lack of humanity. His total objectification of his victims as things rather than people. He kept pieces of the victims as souvenirs, trophies of his crimes. Later, he methodically disposed of their remains in remote locations in the Santa Cruz Mountains, scattering parts in different areas to make discovery and identification more difficult. The bodies weren't discovered for months, and when they were finally found, the condition of the remains made identification extremely challenging. Marianne's and Anita's families waited for their daughters to come home, not knowing that they would never walk through the door again. Missing person reports were filed, friends searched, flyers were posted. But months passed without answers, without closure, without justice. 4 months after Marianne and Anita disappeared, Edmund was ready to act again. On September 14th, he picked up 15-year-old Aiko Ku, a talented dancer who was hitchhiking to a dance class in San Francisco. Aiko was a bright, promising young girl with her whole life ahead of her, passionate about dance and excited about her future. Edmund picked her up near Highway 1, offering her a ride in his presentable Ford Galaxy. Once again, he seemed safe. He was older, seemed responsible, and was going her direction. Aiko, like so many others, had no reason to suspect danger. Edmund drove her to a remote area, holding her captive before ending her life. The details of what he did during this time show a pattern that was developing. He was taking more time with his victims, becoming more confident in his ability to avoid detection, more brazen in his actions. Once again, he brought the body back to his apartment while his mother was away at work. He committed further horrible acts before methodically disposing of Aiko's remains in the mountains. Her body was found in pieces months later, discovered by hikers in a remote area. The investigation was complicated by the remote location, the condition of the remains, and the length of time that had passed since her disappearance. Aiko's family was devastated. Their talented, beautiful daughter was gone, taken by violence they couldn't comprehend. The dance community mourned a promising young artist. But still, no one connected these crimes. The pattern wasn't yet clear to investigators. By January 1973, Edmund had moved back in with his mother in Aptos, a decision that increased his rage and his need to act out violently. Clarnell was working at UC Santa Cruz, and their home was near the campus, surrounded by potential victims. On January 8th, Edmund picked up Cindy Shaw, a student at Cabrillo College. Cindy was bright, friendly, and trusting, like so many young women of her generation, who had grown up believing in the general goodness of people. Edmund took her to a quiet area in Santa Cruz and ended her life. This time, displaying the escalating boldness that often characterizes such offenders, he brought her body back to his mother's house in Aptos. While his mother was home, sleeping in her bedroom, Edmund stored parts of Cindy's remains in his bedroom closet. He lived with this horrific secret in his closet for days, his mother completely unaware of what was mere feet from where she slept. Later, he removed the remains piece by piece, disposing of them in various locations. Cindy's remains were discovered in February 1973 near Highway 1, and this discovery finally began to make investigators realize they might have a serious problem. Just weeks after Cindy's remains were discovered, Edmund struck again. On February 5th, 1973, he picked up two more victims, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, both students at UC Santa Cruz. The young women were hitchhiking off campus when Edmund's familiar Ford Galaxy pulled up. By this point, warnings had started to circulate around campus about hitchhiking safety, but many students still felt that taking rides was necessary for getting around. Public transportation was limited, cars were expensive, and hitchhiking had been safe for so long that it was hard to believe it had suddenly become dangerous. Rosalind and Alice got into Edmund's car, probably chatting with him about campus life, classes, their plans for the day. Edmund seemed like someone who belonged in their world, someone connected to the university community. He drove them to a quiet location and ended both of their lives quickly and efficiently. Their bodies were later found in Eden Canyon, and this discovery finally made it crystal clear to law enforcement. Santa Cruz had a serial offender operating in their community, someone who was specifically targeting young women, particularly college students. The pattern was undeniable now. Someone was hunting the young women of Santa Cruz. By early 1973, the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office had recovered remains from multiple victims. The pattern was clear. Young women, often students, often hitchhikers, disappearing from similar locations. The community was terrified. Parents forbade daughters from hitchhiking. The university issued warnings. But the person responsible remained unidentified. What investigators didn't know was that he was closer than they imagined. Edmund Kemper was sitting in the jury room, listening to detectives discuss the very crimes he'd committed. He learned what evidence they had, what leads they were following, what mistakes they thought the offender was making. This gave him an incredible advantage. He knew exactly how much danger he was in, which at that point was very little. Nobody suspected the friendly giant who bought rounds of drinks and asked thoughtful questions about police work. On Good Friday, Edmund's rage toward his mother reached its breaking point. In the early morning hours, while she slept, he entered her room with a hammer and ended her life. He then committed further acts of desecration that revealed the depth of his hatred. But he wasn't finished. Later that day, Edmund called his mother's friend, Sally Hallett, inviting her to the house for a surprise dinner for his mother. When Sally arrived, Edmund ended her life as well. He then took his mother's car and drove east, eventually reaching Colorado. For 3 days, he waited for news reports, expecting a massive manhunt. But nobody had discovered the bodies. Nobody was looking for him. In Pueblo, Colorado, Edmund decided he was tired of waiting. He called the Santa Cruz Police Department from a payphone and told them he'd harmed several people, including his mother. The officers who answered knew Edmund. They thought it was a bad joke. They hung up. He called back. Again, they didn't believe him. This friendly guy from the bar? The one who asked about police work? No way. Edmund called multiple times, finally convincing them to at least check his mother's house. When officers entered the residence, they found the horrifying scene. Edmund had been telling the truth. He was arrested in Colorado and extradited back to California. During interrogations, he confessed to all 10 cases, providing details that only the person responsible could know. He gave locations of remains. He explained his methods. He talked for hours, seemingly relieved to finally share what he'd done. Edmund was charged with 8 counts relating to the deaths. His trial began in late 1973. His defense argued insanity, pointing to his history at Atascadero and his diagnoses. But prosecutors presented evidence of extreme premeditation and planning. They showed how Edmund had prepared his car, studied police procedures, hidden his crimes, and maintained a completely normal appearance. The jury heard recordings of his confessions, delivered in a calm, matter-of-fact tone that chilled everyone in the courtroom. After deliberating, the jury found Edmund guilty on all counts. He was found to be sane during the commission of his crimes. California had recently reinstated the death penalty, and Edmund expected that sentence. During the sentencing phase, the judge asked Edmund what he thought his punishment should be. His response was telling: elimination by any means possible. However, the death penalty ruling was later overturned on technical grounds. Instead, Edmund received 8 concurrent life sentences. Edmund was sent to California Medical Facility in Vacaville, later transferred to California State Prison Folsom. Over the decades, he has become one of the most cooperative subjects for criminal psychology research. He's given extensive interviews, helping researchers understand the psychology behind such crimes. He's expressed remorse, though whether it's genuine remains debated. He's assisted in training FBI profilers at Quantico. Edmund has been eligible for parole multiple times, but has never been granted release. He has reportedly waived his right to parole hearings, stating he doesn't deserve to be free. As of the last reports, he remains incarcerated, now in his 70s. It's crucial to remember that behind these crimes were real people with real lives. Maud and Edmund Kemper Sr., grandparents trying to help their troubled grandson. Marianne Pesci and Anita Luchessa, 18-year-old friends, college students with futures ahead of them. Aiko Ku, 15-year-old girl on her way to dance class. Cindy Shaw, college student pursuing her education. Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, friends, students, young women full of potential. Clarnell Strandberg, a mother with a complicated relationship with her son, but still a human being. Sally Hallett, a friend who walked into a nightmare. Each of these individuals had families who loved them, friends who missed them, and lives that were stolen. Edmund Kemper's case reveals multiple systemic failures. A 15-year-old who ended 2 lives was released after just 5 years, despite objections from mental health professionals. His juvenile records were sealed, hiding his dangerous history. He was placed with the very person, his mother, who triggered much of his rage. Mental health facilities need better protocols for assessing genuine rehabilitation versus learned responses. The criminal justice system must better track individuals with violent histories. Parole decisions should weight professional psychological assessments more heavily. Edmund displayed warning signs throughout his youth: harming animals, violent fantasies, social isolation, and deep resentment toward his mother. While not every troubled child becomes dangerous, these red flags should trigger intervention and support. Early mental health intervention matters. Family dynamics that involve abuse, ridicule, or isolation can have severe consequences. Creating safe channels for troubled youth to receive help could prevent future tragedies. The victims in this case often made a choice common in the 1970s: hitchhiking. While we can't blame victims for being targeted, we can learn from how predators operate. They appear normal, friendly, safe. They exploit trust. Teaching awareness without victim blaming means understanding that danger doesn't always look dangerous. Trust your instincts. Share your plans. Understand that intelligence and charm can mask harmful intentions. Edmund Kemper's crimes contributed to significant changes in how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases, particularly when patterns emerge. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit studied his case extensively, improving criminal profiling techniques that help identify and catch offenders more quickly today. His cooperation with researchers, while disturbing to consider, has genuinely helped develop better understanding of criminal psychology, potentially preventing future crimes through improved detection and intervention. The story of Edmund Kemper reminds us that awareness and early intervention can save lives. If you found this documentary informative, please share it to spread awareness about the warning signs and systemic improvements we still need. Subscribe to stay informed about true crime cases and the lessons they teach us. Together, we can work toward a future where such tragedies are prevented through education, better mental health support, and community vigilance.
Now, let's move on to the second horrifying serial killer story.
They had not dealt with anyone of his caliber before. They were reluctant to admit that things like this would occur in a communist state.
They wanted to get the confession. If you read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, I think that you'll see that the confession is a very powerful symbol and very powerful element in Russian culture.
I think he is the worst. I think he would be number one on the monster list there.
The officer sat down across from him, pulled out a notebook, and waited. The man on the other side of the table looked like a retired school teacher. Glasses, gray hair, quiet hands. Then he started talking. And he did not stop for hours. He corrected the investigators. They thought he had harmed 36 people. He said that number was wrong. The real number was 56. He listed the locations. He described details only the person responsible could know. He offered to take them to burial sites they had never found. And when they asked him how he managed to do this for 12 years, passing through checkpoints, riding public trains, living a normal life, he simply said, nobody was really looking. The question is, was he right? Between 1978 and 1990, women and children went missing across the Rostov region of southern Russia. Evidences were found near railway lines, in forests, along riverbanks, and the Soviet government said nothing publicly. The official position was clear. Problems of this nature did not exist in the USSR. So families searched alone, investigators worked in silence, and the man responsible kept boarding public trains. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in the village of Yabloknoy in Ukraine, in the middle of one of the most devastating food crises in Soviet history. Stalin's enforced agricultural collectivization had emptied villages of food and hope. Chikatilo's mother told him, from a very young age, that before he was born, his old day, whether that story was true, has never been confirmed. But it lodged in his mind permanently. He described the effect of it to investigators and psychiatrists decades later, saying it had produced in him both deep revulsion and an unhealthy fascination he never shook. His father Roman was sent to war in 1941 when Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. Roman was captured and held as a prisoner of war. In Soviet society at the time, being taken prisoner was not treated as misfortune. It was treated as dishonor and disloyalty. Roman came home after the war wearing that label, and Andrei inherited the social punishment that came with it. At school, he was already an outsider. He was bullied relentlessly. He had serious problems with his vision, but refused to wear glasses because he feared the reaction from other students. A boy with no real place among his peers and no path out of the shame his family carried. Despite everything, Chikatilo was academically strong. He became the political information officer at school and edited the school newspaper. When he finished secondary school, he applied to Moscow State University to study law, a course that would have taken him far from the village he grew up in. He failed the entrance examination. He chose to believe this was because of his father's reputation rather than his own performance. That self-justifying logic, that his failures were always the result of forces working against him, became a pattern that defined the rest of his life. He completed military service between 1957 and 1960, working in a KGB communications unit stationed in Berlin. When he returned, he settled in Rodionovka, a town near Rostov, and found work as a telephone engineer. His sister, worried that he had shown absolutely no interest in forming a relationship, arranged a meeting with a woman named Fina. They married in 1963. Despite serious and ongoing physical difficulties in their relationship, difficulties Chikatilo acknowledged frankly to investigators years later, the couple had 2 children, a daughter named Lyudmila, born in 1965, and a son named Yuri, born in 1969. From the outside, the household looked entirely unremarkable. Chikatilo enrolled at Rostov University as an external student and studied Russian literature. After completing his degree, he moved into teaching, a career that placed him in daily contact with young people and gave him an authority he had never had in any other context. In the classroom, that authority dissolved immediately. Students did not take him seriously. They mocked him. They ignored him. He had no ability to enforce discipline and no idea how to earn it. What was unfolding beneath that professional failure was far more serious. From the mid-1970s onward, a pattern of complaints began accumulating against Chikatilo from students and parents at every school he worked in. There were reports of improper physical behavior, privacy violation, and misconduct. In 1973, he harmed a 15-year-old student. The school board was told. No action followed. At one posting where he was given responsibility for overseeing a boys' dormitory, he was found committing misconduct against a student while the boy slept. Older students found out and confronted him physically. He began carrying a sharp object for protection against the students he had wronged. None of these incidents were formally reported to the police. School administrators handled each episode internally, apparently unwilling to produce documentation that would reflect badly on their institution. By 1978, he had arrived in Shakhty, a coal mining town north of Rostov, and taken a position at vocational school number 33. Around this time, without telling his wife, he purchased a small, run-down house on Mezhevoy Lane on the edge of town, across the road from the Giva River. He gave no explanation for the purchase. Nobody asked for one. On December 22, 1978, 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova was on her way home from school in Shakhty. A woman named Svetlana Guzeva, waiting at a nearby tram stop, noticed a tall, middle-aged man with glasses whispering to a young girl in a red coat. He held a shopping bag. The girl did not appear to know him. Guzeva watched as they walked away together. Her tram arrived. She got on and left. Authorities located Yelena in the Giva River 2 days later. When police searched the area around the river, they found physical evidence on the doorstep of a small house on Mezhevoy Lane, the house Chikatilo had purchased. The light inside had been left on. Neighbors confirmed who owned it. Chikatilo was brought in for questioning. His wife provided an alibi, confirming he had been home that evening. He was released. A 25-year-old local man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a prior conviction on a separate case, was subsequently arrested. Under pressure during interrogation, Kravchenko confessed. He was convicted, received the death penalty, and the sentence was carried out in the early 1980s. The person who had actually taken Yelena Zakotnova's life was already free and had moved on. He would later confirm this himself in precise detail in a KGB interrogation room 12 years later. Nearly 3 years passed after the Zakotnova case with no new incidents recorded. Then, on September 3, 1981, 17-year-old Larisa Tkachenko was found in woodland near the Rostov Public Library. She had last been seen at a nearby bus stop. June 1982. 13-year-old Lyuba Biryuk got off a bus in the Donskoy district and was followed. Investigators recovered her 2 weeks later. The summer heat had left very little for investigators to work with. July brought another case. August brought 2 more, 3 days apart. September brought 2 additional cases. By December 1982, the total for that year alone had reached 8. The individuals were diverse: young girls, young boys, women in their late teens and 20s. And that variety caused early investigators to seriously consider the possibility that more than one person was responsible. It was exactly the kind of confusion that allowed Chikatilo to continue undetected. In September 1983, Moscow dispatched Major Mikhail Fetisov and his team to Rostov after local investigators failed to produce any meaningful progress. Fetisov's assessment was direct. The local police were out of their depth, the cases were clearly the work of one individual, and the situation was being dramatically under-resourced. A new operational unit was created. Forensic specialist Viktor Burakov was placed in charge of the ground investigation. The operation was given a name: Forest Strip. For the first time, the full weight of a dedicated task force was pointed at the problem. But the Soviet system created its own obstacles. The city militia and the federal prosecutors operated in parallel with overlapping responsibilities and a chronic institutional rivalry between them. Evidence was gathered separately by different agencies and not always shared. The card index of persons of interest would eventually contain 15,000 names, and the biological evidence recovered from the cases, which investigators trusted absolutely, was sending them in the wrong direction entirely. As the investigation expanded, the pressure to show results produced serious and damaging mistakes. A man named Shabarov, who had learning difficulties, was picked up after being seen behaving strangely near a tram depot. During interrogation, he began making statements that connected him and 4 associates to several of the cases. All 5 were arrested. The questioning they faced over the following weeks was coercive and relentless. Despite confessions, the men could not correctly identify locations, deceased persons, or specific details of any individual case. While they remained in custody, the cases continued. One of the men ended his own life while detained. Eventually, the contradictions became impossible to dismiss, and all 5 were released. By 1984, Viktor Burakov had reached a point of desperation. The standard methods had failed across 6 years of searching. He made a decision that went against every established norm of Soviet law enforcement. He approached Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, a psychiatrist at the Rostov Medical Institute, and asked him to construct a behavioral profile of the person they were looking for. The request was genuinely unusual. Soviet ideology had always resisted the idea that a person with serious psychological disorders could function within normal society. The suggestion implied a flaw in the system that produced that society. Bukhanovsky had no existing framework to work from. He built his approach from scratch using the limited case information Burakov could share. 10 days later, he delivered a written report. The person they were seeking was probably between 45 and 50 years old. He would have a documented history of intimate difficulties. He would present as entirely ordinary in public. He would be educated. He would have almost no genuine friendships. He would derive his only available satisfaction through acts of harm against others, because conventional intimacy was something he had never been able to access. It was not comprehensive, but the accuracy of it, measured against what would eventually be confirmed about Chikatilo, was extraordinary. Burakov kept the profile and continued building his investigation around it. Inspector Alexander Zanasovsky had been assigned to plainclothes patrol duty at the Rostov bus station in September 1984. The previous 2 confirmed cases had both originated from transport locations, and Burakov believed the person responsible kept returning to the same environments. Zanasovsky understood this instinctively. He positioned himself at the station and watched the crowd with the patience of someone who had done this for years. Within a few days, a man caught his attention. Middle-aged, glasses. He kept moving around the station approaches, initiating conversations with young women and girls, being turned away, and then immediately redirecting his attention to the next person he spotted. The persistence was distinctive. Zanasovsky approached him and asked for identification. The man gave his name as Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. He said he was a supply clerk returning from a work trip. He was calm and produced his papers without hesitation. His documents showed a connection to a KGB-affiliated division, which added a layer of bureaucratic delicacy to the situation. Zanasovsky found a way to hold him. A minor charge of harassing women in a public space, which carried 15 days of custody. When investigators used that window to search his background, they found the trail of complaints from schools across the region. They found he owned a house near the river in Shakhty, the same river where Yelena Zakotnova had been found in 1978. When they searched his bag, they found a small blade, a length of rope, and Vaseline. Everything assembled itself into a clear picture. And then the laboratory results came back. The biological evidence recovered from the scenes had consistently indicated that the person responsible had type A/B blood. When investigators tested Chikatilo, his blood came back type A. The 2 did not match. Under Soviet forensic science at the time, this was considered absolute. Chikatilo was, in fact, a biological non-secretor, an extremely rare condition in which the markers used to determine blood type from one form of bodily evidence do not appear in another. His blood was type A. Other biological evidence produced by his body was type AB. The laboratory result was technically accurate. The scientific assumption behind it was wrong. He was held on a minor theft charge connected to his workplace long enough to gather information. Eventually, he was released. Zanisovsky was certain they had identified the right person and continued pressing the case. His superiors reviewed the blood evidence and overruled him. Chikatilo collected his belongings, walked out of the building, and returned to the railway stations. The 6 years that followed would add dozens more cases to the file. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985, the shift toward glasnost, greater openness, allowed the investigation to operate with slightly more flexibility. Isa Kostoyev, a senior investigator from the KGB's Department of Crimes of Special Importance, was assigned overall command of the case. He restructured the operation into 3 geographically focused teams, covering Shakhty, Novoshaktinsk, and Rostov. He authorized surveillance of nightclubs and adult establishments. He put former officers dismissed for misconduct under scrutiny. He deployed hundreds of plainclothes operatives across transport hubs across the entire region. In a move that surprised many inside the investigation, Viktor Burakov visited Novocherkassk detention facility in 1985 and requested an interview with Anatoly Slivko, a separate offender awaiting execution for the harm of 7 boys. Burakov wanted to understand how a person with these tendencies was able to function within ordinary Soviet society for years without detection. The conversation gave him specific insights into patterns of behavior and the psychology of concealment that he incorporated into how the team approached their search. On August 1, 1985, Chikatilo was in Moscow on a work trip. Near Domodedovo Airport, he encountered 18-year-old Natalia Poklistova, who appeared to be traveling alone and in difficult circumstances. He offered to accompany her. Authorities located her 2 days later, 200 meters from her home. A rope had been used. She had been struck multiple times with a sharp object. The August case and a second case the same month drove Kostoyev to request significantly more resources from Moscow. The operation was now one of the largest police mobilizations in Soviet history. Through 1986 and 1987, the cases extended to Leningrad and to Uzbekistan. Chikatilo's supply clerk position required him to travel legitimately, and he used every trip as an opportunity. In December 1985, not knowing that police helicopters were patrolling the woodland corridors near railway lines, he joined a volunteer militia search party that had been organized to help find the very person he was. He walked alongside investigators in the same forest areas where he had operated. He knew the patrol patterns because he was part of them. By 1988, the profile of the cases had shifted. Of the 16 incidents between early 1988 and Chikatilo's final arrest in November 1990, 11 involved male individuals. Dr. Bukhanovsky later noted that Chikatilo described this shift himself during the confession, explaining that by the later years, the identity of the person no longer mattered to him. What mattered was the experience of dominance and control. The act itself had become the entire purpose, disconnected from any other factor. In January 1990, 11-year-old Andrei Kravchenko was taken from the streets of Shakhty. In March, 16-year-old Yaroslav Makarov skipped school, went to the train station, and was never seen alive again. Chikatilo took him to the botanical gardens in Rostov. Yaroslav's was recovered the following day. In July, 13-year-old Viktor Petrov was waiting at a morning bus stop when he disappeared. His case also took place in the botanical gardens, within a short distance of where Yaroslav Makarov had been found months earlier. The brazenness of operating in the same location twice within months suggested either a total disregard for detection or a certainty that the person responsible would not be caught. On November 6, 1990, Sergeant Igor Rybov was on duty near a rural station called Leskos when he spotted a man emerging from the tree line. The man was moving unsteadily. His clothing showed signs of recent physical activity. There was a bandage on one finger. On his cheek and ear there were traces of what appeared to be biological material. Rybov approached him, checked his identification papers, and found nothing immediately actionable. A train arrived at the platform. There was no legal basis to detain the man further. He was allowed to board. Rybov filed a report about the encounter. Days later, the human evidence of 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik was located in the woodland near that same station. She had been taken there on the same day Rybov had seen the man at the platform. Investigators reviewing the station logs pulled the name from Rybov's report. Cross-referencing it against the case files, they began checking Chikatilo's documented work travel against the confirmed dates and locations of cases going back years. The alignment was almost complete. On November 20th, 1990, 3 plainclothes officers tracked Chikatilo to the town of Novocherkassk. They observed him making contact attempts near a local park, first approaching a boy who was quickly called away by a woman, then moving toward another child who also moved on. The officers closed in. Chikatilo was taken into custody without resistance. He sat in the back of the vehicle on the way to Rostov and said nothing at all. Officers went directly to his home. Inside, they found a hammer, more than 20 knives, and a pair of shoes that matched footprints recovered from the scene of an unidentified woman's case. When his blood and biological samples were analyzed this time, the full picture emerged. Blood type A. Other biological evidence? Type AB. He could be AB. He was the match. Kostoyev led the interrogation personally. For days, Chikatilo said almost nothing. He wrote letters to the prosecutor's office instead, measured oddly formal documents that described inner conflict and psychological pressure without admitting to any specific act. He wrote that he was prepared to give testimony, but asked not to be pressed on details because, as he put it, his mind would not bear it. He expressed gratitude toward the investigators for apprehending him. Kostoyev asked Dr. Bukanovsky, the psychiatrist who had written the 1984 profile, to come in. Bukanovsky entered the room without an investigator's posture. He told Chikatilo that what he was interested in was understanding the case from a scientific and psychological perspective. He said his goal was not prosecution, but comprehension. Chikatilo responded to this. He was then shown the psychological profile Bukanovsky had written in 1984, the document that described the type of person investigators had been searching for. He read it through quietly. Then he said, "Yes, it's me." On December 5th, 1990, the formal confession began. He had been charged with 36 cases. He said that number was wrong. He admitted to 56. He described all the details with a precision that left investigators in no doubt about the authenticity of what they were hearing. He offered to take officers to sites they had never found. On December 7th, Chikatilo was transported to Shakhty. He led officers to the city's central cemetery and directed them to a specific location. Beneath the surface was a shallow burial site containing the human evidence of 10-year-old Alexei Kobatov, who had disappeared on August 28, 1989. His mother, Lydia Kobatova, had been waiting for 15 months with no information. She'd eventually visited a fortune teller in her desperation for any word about her son. The fortune teller had told her the boy was gone. The police had told her nothing. Chikatilo stood at the site, filmed by investigators, and watched as the evidences were uncovered. Officers present later described his expression as completely still. Among the items recovered were the boy's sneakers, which his mother identified immediately. She had bought them herself and watched him put them on the morning he left. During the confession sessions, Chikatilo explained in methodical terms how he had operated for 12 years. He said he targeted people at transport locations, bus stops, station waiting rooms, railway platforms, because those environments produced a constant flow of people who were alone, distracted, or in need of assistance. With children, he offered chewing gum or the promise of food or entertainment. With young women, he described a shortcut to another station or a quicker route home. He said the approach was never complicated. He said, "I just said to all of them, let's go. Let's have something to eat." They were everywhere, at every stop. I didn't have to look for them. He described a physical sensation that overcame him once persons affected were in a woodland area. A shaking, he said, felt like a fever. He said conventional physical response had been impossible for him since adolescence, and that the escalation to direct harm had begun at the moment of his first incident in 1978, and had continued because it was the only experience that produced any reaction in him at all. He addressed the subject of the eyes directly. He said that as a child, growing up around older folk beliefs in rural Ukraine, he had absorbed the idea that a person's final conscious image remains fixed in their eyes after death. He said he had acted on this belief across many of the cases. When investigators heard him describe it, calmly, specifically without visible emotion, some left the room, others sat down. He confirmed that Alexander Kravchenko had played no part in the 1978 Zakotnova case. That confirmation, on record, directly in the voice of the person responsible, led to Russia's Supreme Court posthumously rescinding Kravchenko's sentence in 1991. The Soviet Union was formally dissolved on December 26, 1991. Andrei Chikatilo's trial, which opened on April 14, 1992, became one of the first large-scale criminal proceedings in the newly formed Russian Federation. It was held at the Rostov Regional Court, under Judge Leonid Akubzhanov. For the first time in a case of this kind in Russia, cameras and journalists were permitted inside the courtroom. Reading the charges took Judge Akubzhanov 2 full days. The case files ran to more than 200 volumes. When specific cases were described in detail, the ages, the locations, the physical evidence recovered, some people in the gallery fainted. On several occasions, members of the court security detail had to be temporarily removed and replaced because they were no longer able to remain present. Chikatilo was placed inside a steel cage at the front of the courtroom throughout the proceedings. The decision was not to protect the public from him. It was to protect him from the families seated 20 feet away. The courtroom held close to 200 people on most days. Medical staff circulated through the gallery distributing sedatives to family members whose distress became physical. Chikatilo was permitted to address the court and spoke for nearly 2 hours. He described his childhood, the period of starvation, The bullying, the failures, the humiliation. He said he had dreamed of a meaningful political career and had instead spent his life among strangers on trains and in waiting rooms. He described himself as a person systematically denied a normal existence by forces beyond his control. He assigned blame to everyone and accepted none. His behavior during the proceedings was erratic. He sang at unexpected moments. He shouted over testimony. He exposed himself to the courtroom and made a statement about his physical condition, apparently attempting to suggest that his dysfunction was a form of victimhood. Judge Akubzhanov questioned him directly multiple times about specific cases, asking how he could have carried out what the evidence showed without any apparent awareness of pain he was causing. Chikatilo's answer was always the same: "I cannot explain." One family member in the gallery called out that he was a cursed soul. Another said she wanted to do to him everything he had done to her daughter. The mother of 10-year-old Alexei Kobotov said she hoped for him the most terrible end imaginable. The judge had to repeatedly pause proceedings as the room lost its composure. At one point, a metal bar was thrown through the bars of the cage. It missed Chikatilo's head by a few centimeters. The man who threw it was briefly removed, then released. Chikatilo's defense lawyer, Murad Kabailov, argued throughout the trial that his client was not legally responsible for his actions, that the psychological evaluation showed a man incapable of rational choice. The 60-day psychiatric assessment conducted at Moscow's Serbsky Institute had identified serious abnormalities in Chikatilo's development from childhood, shaped by war, scarcity, poverty, and repeated trauma. But the evaluation's conclusion was clear. Chikatilo had retained the capacity to plan, to make deliberate choices, to adapt his behavior based on risk, and to conceal his actions across more than a decade. He had carried weapons intentionally. He had selected vulnerable targets specifically. He had traveled to unfamiliar regions to reduce the chance of recognition. The court determined he was legally competent to stand trial and to be sentenced accordingly. Judge Akubzhanov delivered his verdict in October 1992. He found Chikatilo guilty on 52 of the 53 counts brought before the court. The single omission involved one case where evidentiary certainty could not be established to the required standard. The guilty verdicts covered 21 boys aged between 8 and 16, 14 girls aged between 9 and 17, and 17 women aged 18 and above. The crimes had been committed across southern Russia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan between 1978 and 1990. Every guilty count carried an individual sentence. As the verdicts were read, the courtroom broke into applause. From inside the cage, Chikatilo shouted, demanded a lawyer, kicked his bench over, and called the judge a fraud. He was removed from the court. Russian President Boris Yeltsin subsequently refused his appeal personally. The sentence was final. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was taken from his cell and the sentence was carried out shortly afterward. He was 57 years old. He issued no final statement. His wife Fina and their children had already changed their names and relocated to an undisclosed address. They did not attend. Alexander Kravchenko was given death penalty in the early 1980s for the 1978 Zakhotnova case, a case that Chikatilo himself admitted to, in full detail, during his December 1990 confession. Russia's Supreme Court posthumously rescinded Kravchenko's sentence in 1991. That formal exoneration arrived too late to mean anything to Kravchenko. It was a legal acknowledgement, not a remedy. His family received no explanation adequate to what had been done. At least one suspect interrogated in the early years of the investigation took his own life while in custody. Another made an attempt on his own life. A significant number of men with learning difficulties were subjected to coercive questioning techniques across the years of the search. People whose vulnerability made them easy targets for an investigation that needed to show movement. None of them were the person responsible. All of them paid a cost. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky received formal recognition from Moscow for his contribution to the investigation. The behavioral profiling methodology he developed, constructed entirely from scratch because no Soviet framework for it existed, became the foundation for a new department within Russian law enforcement dedicated specifically to cases of serious and repeated offending. The Chikatilo investigation became one of the most studied cases in the development of criminal behavioral science, referenced in training programs across multiple countries. Inspector Zanisovsky, who had identified Chikatilo in 1984, who had held him, and who had been demoted for refusing to accept the blood type result as the final word, was never formally rehabilitated. When the 1990 arrest was confirmed to be the same man he had flagged 6 years earlier, he was asked by journalists how he felt. He said he was angry. He said that was not an adequate word for it. He said he had known all along, and that the knowledge had not protected anyone. Chikatilo admitted to 56 cases. He was convicted on 52. The true number has never been established with certainty. His work travel took him to regions and cities across the Soviet Union over more than a decade, and the investigation focused primarily on the Rostov area. Cases he described during confession from locations further afield had never previously been connected to any investigation. Some families were notified for the first time during the confession process that their lost, damned relative had been found. 52 confirmed people. 21 boys, 14 girls, 17 women. Children who had been to the cinema, teenagers who had run away from difficult situations and were trying to get somewhere better. Young women who were offered a meal or a shorter route home. People who trusted a tall, quiet man with glasses who said he knew a shortcut. Let's go. They followed him. They had no reason not to. Their names are on the court record. Their cases filled more than 200 volumes. For many of their families, the trial produced a verdict, but not a resolution. The resolution they needed was the one that had been available in 1984 and was not taken. That is the part of this story that no court document addresses, and that no sentence changes. Chikatilo was found guilty on 52 counts. Every single one came with a death sentence. On February 14, 1994, it was carried out. The man wrongly given the death penalty for his first case, Alexander Kravchenko, was officially cleared the year before. 52 families never got the full answer they were owed. Know these cases, share this video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because the next story is one that deserves to be heard. Stay safe. Stay aware.
Now, let's move on to the third horrifying serial killer story.
In a quiet neighborhood in Salem, Oregon, behind the ordinary walls of a simple family home, something unimaginable was happening. A woman's body hung suspended from the ceiling of a garage, and a man stood below with a camera, carefully positioning the lifeless form. This wasn't a movie set. This wasn't fiction. This was the private world of Jerome Henry Brudos, a man whose dark obsessions would shock an entire nation. When police finally entered that garage in 1969, what they discovered would haunt them forever. Photographs, women's clothing, shoes, and evidence of crime so disturbing that investigators struggled to comprehend how someone could commit such acts while maintaining the appearance of a normal family man living next door. Between 1968 and 1969, young women began disappearing in Oregon. They vanished from parking lots, from streets, from their normal daily routines. Their families waited for phone calls that never came. Their friends searched desperately for any sign of them. But these women had encountered someone whose twisted desires had transformed him into one of America's most dangerous offenders. What made this case particularly chilling was the double life. By day, Jerry Brudos was a husband and father. He worked as an electrician. He smiled at neighbors. He seemed unremarkable. But behind closed doors, he was living out fantasies that had been building inside him since childhood. Fantasies that would cost innocent women their lives. Jerry Brudos had a fixation that began when he was just 5 years old. It started with a pair of high-heeled shoes. This seemingly innocent childhood curiosity would grow into something dark and consuming. Something that would eventually drive him to commit unspeakable acts. His obsession with women's shoes and clothing wasn't just a peculiarity. It became the foundation of his crimes. 4 confirmed victims. 4 young women whose lives were stolen. 4 families destroyed. But how many others were there? How many encounters did women have with this man that they escaped from, never knowing how close they came to becoming his next victim? How does a child's unusual interest transform into a grown man's deadly compulsion? What signs did people miss? Could these tragedies have been prevented? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how did he operate so openly, bringing victims to his own home, while his wife and children were living under the same roof? This is the story of Jerry Brudos, the criminal whose case would change how law enforcement understood the connection between obsession and violence. This is the story of the victims who deserved so much more from life. And this is the story of how one man's darkest secrets were finally brought into the light. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota, during a harsh winter that seemed to mirror the cold reception he would receive from his mother. His parents, Henry and Eileen Brudos, were struggling financially during the tail end of the Great Depression. They already had one son, Larry, who was older than Jerry. From the very beginning, his life was marked by something that would shape everything that followed. His mother's rejection. Eileen Brudos had desperately wanted a girl. She had dreamed of having a daughter to dress up, to teach feminine skills, to mold in her own image. When Jerry was born, she made no secret of her disappointment. This rejection wasn't subtle or hidden. It was open, constant, and cruel. She would often tell Jerry directly that she had wanted a girl, that he was a disappointment, that his birth was not what she had hoped for. His mother treated him with coldness and disdain throughout his childhood. She favored his older brother Larry and showed him the warmth and affection she denied Jerry. Larry could do no wrong in their mother's eyes, while Jerry could do nothing right. This stark difference in treatment created deep psychological wounds in young Jerry. The one person who should have provided unconditional love instead provided constant rejection. The family moved frequently during Jerry's early childhood, relocating from South Dakota to California. Each move represented Henry Brudos's attempts to find better work and provide for his family. But no matter where they lived, Jerry's relationship with his mother remained toxic and damaging. When Jerry was 5 years old, something happened that would define the rest of his life. At a local junkyard, he found a pair of women's high-heeled shoes, patent leather, with a distinctive shine that caught his eye. He was fascinated by them in a way he couldn't explain. He took them home and tried them on in secret, experiencing a thrill that he had never felt before. When his mother discovered him wearing the shoes, her reaction was explosive and violent. She was furious, not just at what he was doing, but at what it represented to her. She beat him severely and destroyed the shoes, tearing them apart in front of him. But her violent response didn't eliminate his fascination. Instead, it drove it underground, where it would grow in secret and darkness, twisted by shame and the knowledge that his desires were forbidden. This moment was crucial in Jerry's psychological development. The combination of the intense pleasure he felt from the shoes and the intense punishment he received for that pleasure created a powerful and damaging psychological pattern. The forbidden nature of his interest only made it more compelling. The shame attached to it would eventually transform into anger and a need for control. As Jerry grew older, his obsession intensified rather than fading away as childhood fixations often do. He began stealing women's shoes and undergarments from neighbors. He would take them to secret places where he could be alone with them, trying them on, arranging them, deriving satisfaction from possessing them. This wasn't typical childhood curiosity or experimentation. This was something darker, something compulsive that he couldn't control or resist. He would sneak into neighbors' homes when they were away, carefully selecting items from their closets and drawers. He became skilled at not getting caught, learning to cover his tracks and choose moments when he wouldn't be discovered. His ability to compartmentalize and hide this aspect of his personality was developing even in childhood. By his teenage years, his behavior escalated beyond simple theft. He was no longer satisfied with just possessing women's clothing and shoes. He began having fantasies about controlling women, about forcing them to participate in his obsessions. These fantasies grew more detailed and more violent as he matured. At age 17, in 1956, Jerry committed his first known violent act. He abducted a young woman at knife point, forcing her into a secluded location. He made her remove her clothes while he took photographs, satisfying his desire to control and dominate. The young woman was terrified, certain she was going to be harmed further or lose her life. But Jerry let her go, perhaps because he wasn't yet ready to cross the final line into taking someone's life. When the victim reported the attack and Jerry was caught, his parents were shocked. They couldn't understand how their son had become capable of such violence. Jerry was arrested and evaluated by psychiatrists who noted his obsessions and his troubling relationship with his mother. He was briefly sent to Oregon State Hospital, a psychiatric facility, for evaluation and treatment. The doctors there diagnosed him with various psychological issues related to his obsessions and his childhood trauma. They noted his fixation on women's clothing and shoes, his feelings of inadequacy and rejection, and his developing violent fantasies. But after 9 months of treatment, the psychiatric professionals made a decision that would prove tragically wrong. They determined that Jerry was not dangerous enough to require further involuntary treatment. They believed he had made progress and could be released. This would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Jerry had not been cured or even significantly helped. He had simply learned to hide his true thoughts and desires better. He had learned what to say to convince people he was improving. In reality, his obsessions remained as strong as ever, and his violent fantasies continued to develop. In 1961, at age 22, Jerry Brudos married a 17-year-old girl named Darcy Metzler. To the outside world, he seemed to be settling down and becoming a normal adult. He appeared to have moved past his troubled teenage years and was ready to embrace conventional adult life. He became a father, first to a daughter and later to a son. He worked steadily as an electrician, a job that suited his technical skills and intelligence. He appeared to be just another ordinary American working man trying to provide for his family. But behind this mask of normalcy, his obsessions were not gone. They were merely hidden, waiting beneath the surface for opportunities to express themselves. Darcy would later tell investigators and psychologists that Jerry had unusual demands from the very beginning of their marriage. He wanted her to dress in specific ways that fulfilled his fetishes. He wanted her to walk around the house without clothes while wearing high heels. He took photographs of her constantly, often in poses and situations that made her uncomfortable, but that she tolerated because he was her husband. He insisted that she never enter his workshop in the garage. He told her it was his private space where he worked on electrical projects, and that she should respect his need for a place that was his alone. Darcy complied with this demand, believing she was simply accommodating her husband's need for personal space. She had no idea what was really happening in that garage, what dark purposes it would eventually serve. Jerry also exhibited controlling behaviors in other aspects of their marriage. He dictated what Darcy could wear when they went out. He monitored who she spoke to and where she went. He isolated her from friends and family, making her increasingly dependent on him. These control patterns were practice for the ultimate control he fantasized about exercising over women. What Darcy didn't know was that Jerry's fantasies were growing darker and more violent. His need for control was intensifying beyond what his wife could fulfill. Asking her to participate in his fetishes wasn't enough anymore. The photographs he took of her didn't satisfy him the way they once had. He needed more. He needed complete control. He needed women who couldn't say no, couldn't resist, couldn't deny him anything. And soon, simply fantasizing wouldn't be enough either. By 1967, the Brudos family had moved to Salem, Oregon, settling into a modest home in a quiet residential neighborhood. Jerry found work as an electrician at a local electronics company, where his technical skills and reliability made him a valued employee. His co-workers found him somewhat odd and socially awkward, but he was competent at his job and caused no problems. To their neighbors on Center Street, the Brudos family appeared completely normal. Jerry mowed his lawn on weekends. Darcy took care of the children. They didn't socialize much, but they weren't unfriendly. They were simply one more unremarkable family among many in the neighborhood. Jerry built a workshop in their garage where he spent much of his free time. He told Darcy and the children that he was working on electrical projects there, and they believed him. He installed a lock on the door and made it clear that his workshop was absolutely off limits to everyone else in the family. Darcy respected this boundary, never questioning what her husband was doing in there for hours at a time. That garage would become the scene of unimaginable horrors. Jerry was preparing his space, organizing it for the crimes he was planning. He built a pulley system into the ceiling. He created storage areas for his collections. He set up photographic equipment. Everything was being arranged for the moment when he would finally act on the violent fantasies that had been building inside him for decades. Jerry's first known attempt at serious violence in Oregon happened in January 1968, though this attack would not be reported to police until after his arrest. He had been thinking about how to approach potential victims, how to get them to trust him enough to give him access. He came up with a plan that seemed clever to him. He approached a young woman in her neighborhood, claiming to be from a company that was taking foot measurements for a new line of women's shoes. He had business cards printed and prepared a whole story about the company and their research. He was well-dressed and professional in his manner, making himself seem legitimate and trustworthy. He convinced the young woman to let him measure her feet, and she invited him into her home to do so. But once inside, his true intentions became clear. He attempted to assault her, his obsessions overcoming whatever story he had created to gain access. The young woman fought back fiercely, screaming and struggling with surprising strength. Jerry was caught off guard by her resistance and fled before he could complete his attack. This encounter was crucial for several reasons. First, it showed Jerry that his fantasies could become reality, that he could actually approach women and attempt to harm them. The risk excited him. The control thrilled him. Second, it taught him that he needed to be more careful, more prepared. His victim's resistance had surprised him, and he realized he needed better methods of control. Third, it went unreported at the time. The young woman was traumatized and didn't contact police, which meant Jerry faced no consequences. This lack of consequences emboldened him. He began planning more carefully for his next opportunity. He acquired weapons. He thought about locations. He refined his approach. And he started hunting for the right victim, someone vulnerable enough that he could overpower them, someone whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated. Linda Slauson was 19 years old, full of energy and ambition. She was working as an encyclopedia saleswoman for the Universal Encyclopedia Company, going door to door in the Salem area trying to make sales and build a customer base. It was hard work, and she faced rejection constantly. But Linda was determined to succeed. She was saving money and making plans for her future. On January 26, 1968, Linda was working her route in northeast Salem when she knocked on the door of the Brudos home on Center Street. Jerry answered the door. When he saw the young, attractive woman standing there with her sales materials, something triggered inside him. Here was an opportunity. Here was someone who had come right to his door. Jerry invited her inside, claiming he was very interested in purchasing encyclopedias for his children's education. He was charming and enthusiastic, discussing which volumes would be most valuable and asking detailed questions about the content. Linda was pleased to have found such an interested customer. She had no reason to be suspicious or afraid. Jerry asked if she would like to come to his workshop to discuss the purchase further, claiming he kept his checkbook out there and wanted to show her the bookshelf where the encyclopedias would go. Linda agreed, following him to the garage. The moment she entered that workshop, her fate was sealed. Jerry attacked immediately, using the element of surprise to overpower her before she could scream or fight back effectively. He ended Linda's life in that garage, but for Jerry, her passing was just the beginning. What he did next would shock even experienced investigators. He kept her body for days, dressing it in different outfits from his extensive collection of women's clothing. He tried different shoes on her feet, photographing each combination. He posed her body in various positions, treating her remains like a doll to fulfill his twisted fantasies. He suspended her body from the pulley system he had installed in the ceiling, manipulating it as if she were still alive. During this time, Jerry's family continued their normal routines just feet away. Darcy prepared meals in the kitchen. His children played in the yard. Life went on as usual in the Brudos household, while in the garage, something monstrous was happening. When Jerry was finally done with Linda's body, When he had satisfied his immediate desires and the decomposition was becoming a problem, he prepared to dispose of the evidence. He weighted her body down with a heavy automotive transmission and drove to the Long Tom River. Under cover of darkness, he dumped Linda's remains into the water, confident that the weight would keep her submerged and that she would never be found. Linda Slauson disappeared without a trace. Her family reported her missing immediately, but there were no leads. Her employer knew she had been working in the Salem area that day, but they didn't know which specific houses she had visited. Police investigated, but without a body or crime scene, there was little they could do. Linda became another missing person statistic, her family left with agonizing questions and no answers. Jerry had gotten away with it. This success fed his obsessions and made him bolder. He had proven to himself that he could take a life and avoid detection. The risk management he had worried about seemed unnecessary. He began planning his next crime. Almost a year passed before Jerry struck again. During that time, he relived his crime with Linda Slauson repeatedly through the photographs he had taken. He organized his collection of clothing and shoes. He refined his garage workshop, and he waited for the right opportunity. Jan Whitney was 23 years old, working as a secretary and living her life normally. On November 26, 1968, she was driving on Interstate 5 when her car broke down. This was before the age of cell phones, before roadside assistance was easily accessible. Jan was stranded on the highway, vulnerable, and in need of help. Jerry happened to be driving past when he saw her standing beside her disabled vehicle. To him, this seemed like fate. Here was a vulnerable woman, isolated, in need of assistance. He pulled over and offered help, presenting himself as a concerned citizen who wanted to assist someone in distress. Jan was grateful for the help. Jerry told her he was good with cars and could probably fix the problem, or at least help her get to a service station. He was friendly and reassuring, nothing about his manner suggesting danger. Jan accepted his assistance, not knowing she had just encountered someone extremely dangerous. Jerry convinced her to come with him to get tools or parts, claiming he could fix her car but needed supplies. Jan, trusting the man who had stopped to help her, agreed. Instead of taking her to an auto parts store or back to her car, Jerry took her to his garage workshop. Once there, he revealed his true nature. He took Jan's life and then spent hours with her body, engaging in the same disturbing rituals he had performed with Linda Slauson. He dressed her in clothing from his collection. He photographed her extensively from every angle. He tried different shoes on her feet, comparing how they looked. He suspended her body from his pulley system, manipulating it to fulfill his fantasies. For Jerry, this wasn't about anger or revenge. This was about control and the satisfaction of his obsessions. When he was finished, he disposed of Jan's body in the Long Tom River, just as he had done with Linda Slauson. He weighted her down with automotive parts, confident that the river would keep his secret. Once again, a young woman simply vanished. Her family reported her missing. Her abandoned car was found on the highway, which suggested something terrible had happened. But there were no witnesses and no evidence of what had occurred. Jerry had now taken 2 lives and remained undetected. His confidence grew. He was refining his methods, becoming more efficient. The time between his crimes was decreasing. Just 4 months later, Jerry was ready to strike again. Karen Sprinker was 19 years old, a bright student at Oregon State University, studying to become a secretary. She had her whole life ahead of her, filled with plans and dreams and possibilities. On March 27, 1969, Karen was running errands at a Salem department store. She had parked in the parking lot and was returning to her car when Jerry approached her. This time, he didn't rely on charm or deception. He had a gun, and he used it to force compliance. He told Karen to get into his car, and facing the weapon, she had no choice but to obey. Jerry drove Karen to his home, parking in his garage and quickly moving her into his workshop before any neighbors could see. By this point, his process was practiced and efficient. He knew exactly what he was going to do. What happened next was almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. Jerry took Karen's life, but that was only the beginning of what he did to her. He engaged in acts with her remains that demonstrated the depths of his disturbed mind and the complete objectification of women that his obsessions had created. He kept parts of her body as trophies. He took extensive photographs, creating a record of his crimes that he could revisit. He dressed her in clothing from his collection, styling her as if she were a mannequin rather than a human being who had been alive hours before. After several days, when decomposition made keeping her remains problematic, he disposed of most of Karen's body in the Long Tom River, but he kept certain items. Most disturbingly, he kept one of her feet, which he preserved and used to model shoes from his collection. This act demonstrated how completely Jerry had detached from viewing his victims as human beings. To him, they were objects, collections of parts that could fulfill his obsessions. Karen's disappearance sparked immediate concern. Unlike Linda and Jan, whose disappearances could be attributed to various possibilities, Karen simply vanished from a shopping center in broad daylight. Her family reported her missing immediately. Police began investigating, but once again, they had no body, no crime scene, and no witnesses. Less than a month later, Jerry was ready to take another victim. Linda Salih was 22 years old, a secretary. On April 23, 1969, she was shopping at a mall in Portland when Jerry approached her in the parking lot. He used a fake police badge to convince her that her car had been struck by another vehicle and that she needed to come with him to fill out a report. Linda, believing she was dealing with a police officer, complied. Jerry took her to his garage. He ended her life and then spent time with her body, photographing it and fulfilling his fantasies. He eventually disposed of her remains in the Long Tom River, weighting the body down with a cylinder head from a car engine. By the spring of 1969, law enforcement in Oregon was dealing with multiple missing persons cases. Young women were disappearing, and there seemed to be no connection between them. Linda Slauson had vanished while working. Jan Whitney had disappeared from the highway. Karen Sprinker had gone missing from a parking lot. Linda Salih had last been seen at a shopping mall. Investigators looked for patterns, but the cases seemed random. Different locations, different circumstances, different types of victims. Without bodies or crime scenes, the police had little to work with. On April 24, 1969, just one day after Linda Salih disappeared, a fisherman made a grim discovery in the Long Tom River near Corvallis. A woman's body had surfaced, weighted down with car parts, but floating due to decomposition gases. It was identified as Karen Sprinker. Suddenly, law enforcement knew they weren't just dealing with missing persons. They had a case involving someone taking lives. The investigation intensified. On May 10, 1969, another body was found in the same river. This one was Linda Salih. She'd been in the water for barely 2 weeks. The medical examiner's findings were disturbing. Both victims showed signs of severe mistreatment before their passing. Both had been weighted down with automotive parts. Now police knew they were hunting someone extremely dangerous, someone who was likely a local resident with access to car parts and knowledge of the river area. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A college student named Sharon Wood came forward with a disturbing story. She had been approached in a parking lot by a man with a gun. He claimed to be a police officer and tried to force her into his car. Sharon had fought back and escaped, but she got a good look at the man and his vehicle. Sharon worked with police to create a description. She remembered specific details about his car, including some unusual features and the presence of a child's toy visible in the front seat. Using Sharon Wood's description, police began searching for the vehicle. They checked registrations and recent sales records. They interviewed people who matched the general description. The investigation was methodical and thorough. On May 25, 1969, investigators identified a promising lead, Jerry Brudos. His vehicle matched the description. He lived in Salem, near where several of the women had disappeared. He had the technical knowledge that would explain the automotive parts used to weight down the bodies. Police brought Jerry Brudos in for questioning. Initially, he denied everything. He claimed he knew nothing about any missing women. He insisted he was a family man who would never harm anyone. But investigators had evidence. They had Sharon Wood's testimony. They had details about his vehicle. And they had the connection between the automotive parts and his work as an electrician with mechanical knowledge. As the interview continued, Jerry's story began to crack. The investigators pressed harder. Finally, after hours of questioning, Jerry Brudos broke down. He began to confess. But even then, he tried to minimize what he had done, claiming he couldn't control himself, blaming his mother, blaming his obsessions. Armed with Jerry's partial confession, police obtained a search warrant for his home. What they found in his garage workshop confirmed their worst fears. Photographs of women's bodies in various poses and clothing, personal items belonging to the victims, women's shoes and clothing that had been stolen over years, and evidence of the severe harm he had inflicted on his victims. Darcy Brudos, Jerry's wife, was shocked. She claimed she had no knowledge of what her husband had been doing in that garage. She said he had forbidden her and the children from ever entering his workshop, and she had respected that boundary. Investigators believed her. She had been living with a man whose true nature was completely hidden from her. Jerry Brudos was formally charged with 3 counts of ending a life: Karen Sprinker, Linda Sallee, and Jan Whitney. Although he had confessed to also taking Linda Slauson's life, her body had never been recovered, making it difficult to prosecute that case. Prosecutors decided to focus on the cases where they had the strongest evidence. The charges were serious, and if convicted, Jerry faced spending the rest of his life in prison or possibly receiving the ultimate punishment. Jerry's defense attorneys argued that their client was severely mentally ill. They pointed to his troubled childhood, his mother's rejection, his documented obsessions from an early age. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about his psychological condition. The defense claimed that Jerry was not fully responsible for his actions due to mental illness. They argued for a verdict that would send him to a psychiatric facility rather than prison. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They had Jerry's confession. They had physical evidence from his garage. They had the testimony of Sharon Wood, who had escaped from Jerry and could identify him. They had the bodies of the victims with evidence linking them to Jerry. Most importantly, The prosecution argued that Jerry's actions showed planning and deliberation. He had stalked victims. He had chosen vulnerable women. He had created a workshop specifically designed for his crimes. He had taken elaborate steps to hide the bodies. These were not the actions of someone who couldn't control himself. These were the actions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The trial lasted several weeks. The jury heard disturbing details about Jerry's crimes. They saw the evidence from his garage. They heard testimony from investigators and experts. On June 27, 1969, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts. Jerry Brudos was convicted of 3 cases of ending a life in the first degree. The judge sentenced Jerry Brudos to 3 consecutive life sentences. This meant he would never be eligible for parole. He would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. During the sentencing, Jerry showed little emotion. He didn't apologize to the victims' families. He didn't express genuine remorse. To the end, he seemed more concerned with himself than with the pain he had caused. Jerry Brudos was sent to Oregon State Penitentiary to begin serving his life sentences. In prison, he was isolated from the general population for his own safety. Criminals who harm women are not treated well by other inmates, and Jerry needed protection. Over the years, Jerry gave several interviews to psychologists and criminologists who were studying dangerous offenders. He spoke about his crimes in clinical, detached terms, showing little genuine emotion or remorse. He described his victims as objects, not as human beings with families and futures. Despite his life sentences, Jerry made several attempts to gain his freedom. He filed appeals claiming his trial had been unfair. He argued that he hadn't received adequate mental health treatment. He requested parole hearings even though he wasn't technically eligible. Every attempt was denied. The courts and parole boards recognized that Jerry Brudos remained dangerous. He showed no real remorse, no genuine rehabilitation, no understanding of the harm he had caused. On March 28, 2006, Jerry Brudos passed away in prison from liver cancer. He was 67 years old. He had spent 37 years behind bars, almost as many years as he had lived freely. His passing brought no real closure to the families of his victims. Linda Slauson's body was never found. Her family never got to properly lay her to rest. The pain Jerry caused continued long after his own life ended. Looking back at Jerry Brudos's life, we can see warning signs that were ignored or dismissed. His violent behavior at 17 should have resulted in more than 9 months of treatment. His obsessive behaviors should have raised more alarms. His escalating demands on his wife should have been recognized as concerning. But in the 1960s, there was less understanding of how obsessions could escalate into violence. There was less awareness of the patterns that dangerous offenders follow. Jerry Brudos slipped through the cracks of a system that wasn't equipped to recognize what he would become. Sharon Wood survived her encounter with Jerry Brudos because she trusted her instincts. When something felt wrong, she fought back. She didn't comply just because someone claimed to be an authority figure. Her decision to fight and her willingness to come forward helped catch a dangerous criminal. This case reminds us that if a situation feels wrong, it probably is. It's better to be rude and safe than polite and harmed. It's better to cause a scene than to become a victim. The story of Jerry Brudos reminds us to stay aware of our surroundings and trust our instincts when something feels wrong. If this documentary helped you understand the importance of vigilance and awareness, please share it with others and subscribe to help spread this knowledge. Together, We can honor the memories of Linda, John, Karen, and Linda by working to prevent such tragedies in the future. Stay safe, stay aware, and look out for one another.
Now, let's move on to the fourth horrifying serial killer story.
He said his dead father visited him in a dream, told him exactly what he needed to do to become the most powerful healer in all of Indonesia. The instructions were specific: collect the saliva of 70 young women, drink it, and the supernatural power would follow. When he woke up, Ahmed Suradji did one quick calculation. Waiting for 70 women to pass away naturally would take far too long. So he made a different plan. For 11 years, women arrived at his door in North Sumatra, Indonesia, trusting him with their most painful problems. 42 women, 11 years, one man operating in plain sight. That invisibility is not an accident, and it is not a mystery. It was a system, and it worked because he built it inside something much larger than himself. He did not create the conditions that allowed him to operate. He studied them, understood them completely, and used every part of them with precision. To truly understand Ahmed Suradji, you first have to understand the world that built him. Without that foundation, the events that follow feel impossible. But once you see the world he lived in, everything, every decision, every choice, every terrible outcome becomes clear. Indonesia is a nation of over 17,000 islands, home to hundreds of distinct languages, cultures, and belief systems that have existed side by side for thousands of years. Long before formal religion arrived on its shores, the people living across these islands had developed their own ways of making sense of life's most difficult moments. When a child got sick, when crops failed, when a marriage broke apart, when bad luck seemed to follow a family no matter what they did, they turned to a specific kind of person, someone believed to carry a different kind of knowledge. These figures were called dukun. In most Western countries, the closest translation would be shaman. But calling a dukun simply a shaman doesn't fully capture what they meant to the communities that trusted them. In rural Indonesia, especially across the 1980s and 1990s, a dukun was part herbalist, part counselor, part spiritual guide, and a deeply important figure in daily community life. They knew which plants could bring down a fever. They read signs and omens in the natural world around them. They performed rituals that their clients genuinely believed could redirect the course of events. A love charm here, a protection prayer there, a spiritual cleansing for someone carrying heavy grief. 80% of Indonesia's population practices Islam, but centuries of animistic tradition ran quietly beneath that surface, alive and well in the villages and agricultural areas far from major cities. In North Sumatra specifically, a region of dense highlands, fertile fields, and sprawling sugarcane plantations. These beliefs were not old relics tucked away in history books. They were part of everyday life. Children grew up hearing stories about spirits that lived in the fields and rivers. Adults carried small talismans, and when a problem felt too large for any ordinary solution, you went to the dukun. You went without embarrassment, without shame, and without doubt. Because the dukun had always been there, and the dukun had always helped. This is the world Ahmed Suradji was born into. And it is the world he would use to devastating effect. Ahmed Suradji was born on January 10, 1949, in a small rural area close to the city of Medan, the capital of North Sumatra, Indonesia. His early life was defined by poverty, absence, and a constant desire to become something greater than what circumstances allowed. His father was a respected dukun in their community, a man people came to with their problems, their pain, and their hopes. But Ahmad's father passed away when he was very young. Some accounts place this at just months after birth. Others suggest it occurred when Ahmad was in his early teenage years. The exact timing varies across sources. What is consistent across all of them is the effect. Ahmad grew up without the man he most admired, in a household with limited resources and limited options. His formal education ended at the elementary school level. In rural North Sumatra during that era, that was far from unusual. Young boys from poor families were expected to contribute through labor, working the fields, caring for animals, doing whatever was needed to keep the household moving forward. Suradji herded cattle. He worked land. He moved through the expected rhythms of a difficult rural life. But he was not a settled young man. By his early adult years, Suradji had accumulated a pattern of arrests, petty theft, livestock theft, and various conflicts that kept bringing him back into contact with law enforcement. He spent a significant stretch of his youth in and out of prison. By his own account, this period left him feeling stuck, invisible, and overlooked. When he was finally released for the last time, he made a decision. He was going to reinvent himself completely. He was tired of being seen as a criminal. He wanted something that his father had possessed, something he had watched as a child with admiration and longing. He wanted respect, and so he turned to the one path available to him that seemed to hold real promise. He became a dukun. He began studying every book and written document his late father had left behind. Notes on rituals, herbal remedies, spiritual practices, and ceremonial traditions passed down through generations. He sought out older and more experienced dukun in the surrounding region and learned directly from them. He gave himself a new identity, adopting the name Datuk Maringi, meaning an elder with spiritual authority, and presenting himself to the public accordingly. He relocated to the rural outskirts of Medan, purchased land with a sugarcane plantation attached, and opened his home to clients. He also married, not once, but 3 times, all 3 wives being sisters from the same family. In Indonesia's Muslim tradition, a man may take up to 4 wives under certain conditions, but marrying 3 sisters simultaneously was unusual enough to draw community attention and family conflict. His mother disapproved deeply of the arrangement and made her feelings known. Suradji responded by removing her from his home. The 2 reportedly never spoke again. His first and eldest wife, Tumini, became his closest partner in running the household and managing clients. She welcomed visitors, participated in rituals alongside her husband, and over time became far more involved in his activities than anyone from the outside world realized. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Suradji's reputation as a trusted dukun had grown well beyond his immediate neighborhood. He charged clients the equivalent of $200 to $400 per session, a significant sum in rural Indonesia at that time. People came from nearby towns and distant villages alike. Women came seeking love charms, beauty rituals, and spells intended to keep husbands faithful. He donated to local charitable causes. He was seen regularly at the mosque. He helped sick neighbors when the need arose. In 1986, his community gave him the formal title Datuk, a recognition of his standing as a respected elder and spiritual leader. To every person who knew him, Ahmed Suradji was exactly what he appeared to be, a healer who had turned his life around and given himself fully to the service of others. The reality was something else entirely. It was 1986. Suradji was asleep when, according to his own account given to investigators, he received a visitation. His deceased father appeared to him, not as a memory or a vague feeling, as a clear, communicating presence. In this dream, his father delivered a specific directive: If Ahmed truly wanted to become a great and powerful mystic healer, one with abilities that would surpass every other Dukun in the country, there was a ritual he needed to complete. He needed to collect and drink the saliva of 70 young women who had died. Only by doing this would he unlock the kind of supernatural power that would make him truly extraordinary. When he woke up, Suradji considered what he had been told. In his own words, which investigators later documented, "My father told me to drink the saliva of 70 young women. I was thinking it would take ages if I had to wait for 70 women to die naturally. So I took my own initiative." At first, he said he hesitated. He thought it through. He was uncertain. But the desire, the absolute hunger for the power and recognition he believed that ritual would bring him, was stronger than any reservation he had. He had spent his whole life being looked past, locked up, and underestimated. He had finally rebuilt himself into something. This was the final step. In 1986, Ahmed Suradji began acting on the dream. What made Suradji extraordinarily difficult to identify as a suspect was not chance or luck. It was deliberate, careful planning. He had constructed a process that kept each act effectively invisible, and he maintained that process consistently across 11 years. A woman would arrive at his home seeking help with a personal problem. Suradji would listen with patience and offer reassurance. He would collect his fee, between $200 and $400 and perform a preliminary consultation inside the house. Then he would explain that the full ritual, the one with real power, required a specific setting. It had to be done in the sugarcane field. It had to be at night. And she must tell absolutely no one about the visit. If she told someone, he would explain, the ritual's power would be permanently broken. Secrecy was not just preferred, it was required. Clients followed this instruction without question, and not simply because they trusted him. Many of them were already embarrassed about their reason for being there, seeking a Dukun's help for a failing marriage, or for a wish to appear more beautiful, or for financial troubles. These were deeply personal matters. The idea of neighbors or family members finding out was already uncomfortable. So when Suradji told them to keep the visit private, it felt natural. It even felt considerate. The result was that when these women disappeared, the delay before anyone connected their absence to a visit with Suradji was built directly into the plan. Families did not know where their daughters had gone. Friends did not know to check. And in many cases, by the time anyone raised an alarm, there was nothing to connect to him at all. At the sugarcane field, which sat directly adjacent to his property, Suradji would have already prepared a specific location. Sometimes the women themselves helped with the preparation, believing they were participating in a necessary part of the spiritual ceremony. He would instruct each woman to stand inside a dugout space in the earth, while he filled the soil back in around her, up to her waist. This, he told her, was how the ritual drew power from the ground itself. She needed to remain still. It was essential. Standing waist-deep in earth, immobilized, surrounded by tall sugarcane in complete darkness, each woman was fully at his mercy. Many may not have grasped what was actually happening until it was far too late. Suradji would then take a length of electrical cable and use it to end each woman's life. He would collect the saliva that came from her mouth, believing this was the transfer of spiritual essence that his father's dream had described. Afterward, he removed each woman's clothing, believing this would speed up the natural biological breakdown and reduce the possibility of identification. and buried the body completely in the same location. There was one element he never varied. Each buried body was oriented so that the head faced directly toward his house. He believed that positioning the head this way directed the spiritual energy of each individual back toward him, compounding his power with every burial, driving him closer to the goal his father's spirit had set. Over time, the field around his property became something that no one on the outside could see. An unmarked graveyard of 42 women, each one with her face pointed toward the home of the man who had taken her life. The women who came to Ahmed Suradji were not reckless. They were not uninformed. They were people making an entirely reasonable decision by the standards of their community, seeking guidance from a respected healer in a time of personal difficulty. His targets ranged in age from approximately 11 to 30 years old. They came from surrounding villages, nearby towns, and other parts of North Sumatra. Some were women struggling with unfaithful or absent husbands. Some were seeking rituals for better fortune or financial stability. Some were hoping for what they believed were beauty-enhancing ceremonies. A number of them were women in vulnerable professions who came to Suradji hoping for improved circumstances or greater protection in a dangerous line of work. These women were, in many cases, already living on the edges of social visibility. Their disappearances would attract less immediate scrutiny than others might. Suradji was experienced enough, from his years as a criminal, to think carefully about which disappearances would generate fast responses and which would take longer to become alarming. When his regular client flow was slow, investigators later determined that he would actively approach and bring in additional women to maintain the pace of his ritual. He was systematic. He had a goal, and he tracked his progress toward it. There is one documented survivor. A woman who spoke to investigators using the name Yanti said she had visited Suradji seeking a beauty ritual. During the preliminary session inside his home, Suradji gave her a glass of water into which he had silently added his saliva as an undisclosed part of the ceremony. She drank it without knowing. He then led her to the sugarcane field and began the process of placing her inside a dugout space in the earth. Something shifted for Yanti at that moment. A feeling she could not name told her this was wrong. She fought back. She pulled herself free from the soil before it could fully restrain her and ran through the razor-edged sugarcane stalks until she reached safety. She was injured. She was frightened. But she was alive. She did not report what had happened. She was ashamed of having sought out a shaman for personal reasons. She was not completely certain what Suradji had intended. She was afraid of how the visit would be perceived, and so she stayed silent. Because she stayed silent, Suradji continued operating for years more. This pattern of silence, built on shame, on cultural stigma around seeking spiritual help for private matters, on fear of judgment, was one of the central reasons this went on for so long. The women who could not report anything were gone. The one who could, did not. And the families of the missing often had no idea where their daughters had gone, because they had been asked to keep their visits secret and had honored that request. 42 families were left waiting for someone who was never coming home. April 24th, 1997. A 21-year-old woman named Sri Kamala Dewi was going through one of the most painful periods of her life. She and her husband had separated. She wanted her marriage back. She wanted things to be the way they had been. And so she turned to the healer that everyone in the area trusted. She hired a 15-year-old rickshaw driver named Andreas to take her to Suradji's house. Before she stepped out of the rickshaw, she asked Andreas to keep the visit secret. She did not ask him to return for her later. 3 days passed. Sri Kamaladevi did not come home. April 27, 1997. A man walking through the sugarcane field adjacent to Suradji's property noticed a mound of disturbed earth sitting awkwardly between the stalks. It seemed out of place. He went to the village chief, gathered a small group, and returned with lanterns. They pressed a stick into the mound and pulled it back. The odor told them everything they needed to know. They alerted authorities. Around midnight, a team dug up the earth and recovered a decomposing body. The victim was unclothed. She was later identified, through her mother's recognition of her feet, as Sri Kamaladevi. Her mother, who had been searching desperately for days, fainted at the scene when she saw her daughter. The police launched an investigation immediately. Suspicion fell first on Dewey's estranged husband, who was brought in for questioning. But investigators were measured. They kept working. That is when Andreas, the 15-year-old rickshaw driver, came forward. He told police that on the night Sri Kamaladevi disappeared, he had taken her directly to the home of the respected healer known as Datuk, Ahmed Suradji. She had made him promise to say nothing, but now that her body had been found, he felt he had no choice. That one piece of information redirected the entire investigation. Police also recalled that a few years earlier, another woman's body had been discovered in the same general vicinity of the sugarcane field. That case had gone cold. It was now reopened. Police arrived at Suradji's home to question him. He was composed, cooperative in appearance, and had a ready story. Yes, Sri Kamaladevi had come to him. She had been seeking help to reconcile with her husband. He had performed a brief session, sent her on her way at nightfall, and assumed she had returned home safely. He knew nothing of what had happened after that. It was a believable account. Police had no contradicting evidence at that moment. They released him. But they did not stop looking. Detectives went back through missing persons records filed across North Sumatra going back years. What they found was a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Multiple women who had vanished from their communities were known, by at least one family member or neighbor, to have been on their way to see a specific dukun before they disappeared. The same name appeared again and again: Ahmed Suradji. Armed with this information, investigators obtained a search warrant and returned to Suradji's property. Inside his home, police found a collection of items that should not have been there. Piles of women's clothing, handbags, jewelry, personal belongings belonging to multiple women. Among these items, Sri Kamaladevi's family positively identified her bracelet, her clothing, and other items she'd been carrying the night she left home. Investigators also found watches and jewelry that were later connected to at least 25 other women. Ahmed Suradji was arrested on April 30th, 1997. His first wife, Tumini, was detained alongside him. In the interrogation room, Suradji denied everything at first. Then, piece by piece, the account he had constructed began to fall apart. He admitted to Sri Kamaladevi's case, then to more. First, he said 16 women. Then, the number grew again. Finally, he confessed to having caused the deaths of 42 women over an 11-year period. Each one in the same manner. Each one buried in the sugarcane field with her head turned toward his house. He explained the dream. He described the ritual. He described what he had believed each act was doing for him spiritually. He laid out the full logic of 11 years in a few extraordinary hours of testimony. Investigators brought him to the field to confirm the details. He led them to specific locations. He demonstrated the method he had used, using a mannequin for the official record. Then the excavation began. What followed was one of the largest forensic excavations in Indonesian criminal history. Using bulldozers alongside manual digging teams, investigators worked for weeks through the full expanse of the sugarcane plantation. What they unearthed confirmed everything Suradji had said, and then some. 42 sets of remains were recovered from beneath the soil. Some were relatively intact. Others had been reduced entirely to skeletal material after years of natural biological breakdown, making positive identification impossible. Around 80 families across North Sumatra came forward to report missing female relatives from the years in question. A small number of affected individuals were identified through family recognition. Several could not be identified at all. The community was shattered. The man they had trusted, the man they had given a title of honor, the man they had sent their daughters and wives and sisters to see, had been responsible for the worst series of losses North Sumatra had ever witnessed. The trial of Ahmed Suradji began on December 11, 1997, at the Lubuk Pakam District Court in North Sumatra. It became an immediate national sensation. A 363-page indictment detailed the full case against him. The courthouse could not hold the number of people who came. Local authorities set up large tents in the surrounding area with television monitors so that the overflow crowd, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, could follow the proceedings in real time. Inside the courtroom, Suradji sat with a visible calmness that observers found striking. He was 48 years old. He had retracted his confession entirely. Both he and Tumini claimed that their admissions during interrogation had been made under duress, that physical pressure applied during the process had forced them to say things that were not true. Claims of coerced confessions were not without precedent in Indonesia during this period. Human rights organizations had documented examples of Indonesian law enforcement using physical pressure to extract admissions in criminal cases, and the court took the possibility seriously enough to examine it. But the physical evidence standing against Suradji was not built on his words alone. It was built on 42 sets of remains recovered from the ground adjacent to his home, on piles of victims' personal belongings found inside his house, on testimony from dozens of families who placed their missing daughters on a path directly to his door, on the documented reenactment he had participated in at the field, on ritualistic books recovered from his possession that aligned directly with the ritual he had described. Tumini was also tried alongside her husband. Evidence established that she had been present during a number of client consultations, had accompanied at least one victim toward the field, and had helped to conceal evidence in the aftermath of the crimes. During the proceedings, the atmosphere surrounding the courthouse was charged with a kind of collective anxiety that reflected the deeper cultural dimensions of the case. There were people who genuinely feared that Suradji might use supernatural means to influence the outcome of the trial, that he might direct some kind of spiritual harm toward the judges or those observing in the courtroom. Security personnel were instructed to monitor him closely and alert the panel if anything unusual occurred. Several attendees reportedly fell to the floor during the proceedings and had to be assisted out of the courtroom, claiming they had been affected by forces they attributed to the accused. Whether this was psychological in nature, a performance, or something else entirely was impossible to determine. But it illustrated, more clearly than any legal document could, how seriously the community was grappling with what had happened. 7 months of testimony, evidence presentation, and witness accounts brought the trial to a close. On April 27, 1998, exactly 1 year to the day after Sri Kamala Dewi's body had been found in the sugarcane field, a panel of 3 judges delivered their verdict. Ahmed Suradji was found guilty on 42 counts of causing the unlawful deaths of women and girls. The evidence, the court concluded, was indisputable. The sentence was capital punishment by state protocol. The courtroom responded with an outpouring of sound, cheering, weeping, voices raised all at once. Suradji showed no reaction. He remained still and expressionless as the sentence was read. Tumini was also sentenced to death for her role as an active accomplice. That sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment through the appeals process, a decision that drew fierce objection from the families of victims, including Sri Kamala Dewi's mother, who maintained that Tumini bore equal responsibility for what had happened and deserved equal consequences. Ahmed Suradji spent 10 years in prison awaiting the execution of his sentence. His appeals worked through the legal system and were denied at each stage. In that time, he reportedly expressed something that those who spoke with him found more unsettling than rage or regret. He was frustrated, not about what he had done, but about having fallen short of the number his father's spirit had set for him. 70 was the goal. He had reached 42. That gap, by multiple accounts, was what occupied his thoughts. On July 10, 2008, Ahmed Suradji was informed that his execution would take place that afternoon. He was 59 years old. His one request was to see Tumini, his first wife, still serving her life sentence, before the sentence was carried out. The authorities granted it. The two were given a brief final meeting. Whatever passed between them remained private. Afterward, Suradji was led outside. Under standard Indonesian execution protocol, a state execution protocol of 12 men is assembled, but only 3 of the 12 weapons contain active rounds. The rest hold blank rounds. No individual member of the squad can know with certainty whether he was the one who fired the decisive shot. The weight is shared. The accountability is distributed. The squad aimed. The sentence was carried out. Ahmed Suradji passed away on July 10, 2008. Authorities made an initial attempt to bury his remains in a public cemetery in Say Semayang village. More than 100 family members of his victims arrived and refused to allow it. They made clear that they would not permit him to rest on the same ground where affected individual families lived and grieved. Authorities stood down. His body was transported approximately 50 kilometers away from the village and buried in a quiet location without public notice. There was no ceremony, no marker of significance. The man who had spent decades building himself into a figure of authority and spiritual power ended in an unmarked place far from everything he had tried to become. Indonesian writer Joko Supriyanto adapted the case into a film titled Misteri Kebun Tebu, which translates as Mystery of the Sugarcane Plantation, released in 1997 while legal proceedings were still underway. To prepare, Supriyanto met with Suradji face-to-face in order to gather first-hand material. What he encountered, he later described, was nothing like what he expected. Suradji was thin, unremarkable in appearance, unbothered by where he was or what had brought him there. And in that meeting, he reportedly told the writer something that has stayed with observers of this case ever since. He said he had always known, at some point, he would be caught. He kept going anyway. Psychologist Irina Manauli, who assessed Suradji's profile following his arrest, concluded that he demonstrated characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder. He was not assessed as unaware of reality. He was not found to be disconnected from an understanding of right and wrong in the way that legal definitions of insanity require. He knew what he was doing. He understood how other people would view it. He simply did not factor that into his decisions. The combination of a childhood defined by loss and poverty, a long period of being dismissed and criminalized, and then a rapid rise to community authority, followed by genuine belief in the power structure of the spiritual world around him, had produced someone capable of extraordinary sustained harm without any of the visible markers people associate with danger. He was polite. He was generous. He attended the mosque. He helped his neighbors. And for 11 years, nobody looked twice. The case of Ahmed Suradji is genuinely difficult to place in a familiar category. It is not the story of a predator who lurked in shadows. It is the story of a person who stood in full light, was celebrated by his community, and used that celebration as his cover. The women who came to him were not making unreasonable choices. They were doing what their culture and community had always done, seeking guidance from someone trusted, qualified, and respected. The fact that this person had built that trust deliberately, with exactly this purpose in mind, does not reflect on their judgment. It reflects on his. He also exploited the very privacy that made those visits feel safe. By instructing every client to keep her visit secret, he ensured that the connection between his home and a disappearance would take as long as possible to be made. That instruction was not about spiritual effectiveness. It was about operational cover. What happened in North Sumatra in those 11 years was shaped by specific cultural conditions. But the pattern underneath it, a trusted authority figure using that trust to prey on the vulnerable, is not specific to any culture, any country, or any era. People in need are more open. People in need are more willing to follow instructions, keep secrets, and override hesitation because they want so badly for the person in front of them to be able to help. That combination of need and trust in the wrong hands creates enormous risk. The most dangerous individuals are rarely the ones who appear dangerous. They are the ones who appear exactly the way you would want a helper to appear. Indonesia faced this reality in the late 1990s with the case of Ahmed Suradji. In the years since, the country has worked through additional cases involving misuse of spiritual authority. Individuals presenting themselves as healers who exploited clients in various ways. The problem, experts there have noted, is not the existence of the Dukan tradition. It is the absence of accountability for those who wear that identity without honoring what it actually means. 42 women trusted the wrong person, and the world barely knew their names. Share this video so their story is not forgotten. Subscribe to stay informed about the cases that matter. Stay alert about the people you trust, because real danger rarely announces itself. Awareness is the most powerful protection any of us has.
Now, let's move on to the fifth horrifying serial killer story.
In a small interrogation room in Texas, an elderly man sits hunched in a wheelchair. His hands shake slightly as he reaches for a piece of paper. He's 78 years old, with failing health and fading eyesight. But his memory, crystal clear. Too clear. "I can draw them for you," he says quietly to the detectives across the table. "I remember all their faces." What happens next would shake American law enforcement to its core. This man begins sketching portraits. Not one, not 10, but 93 different women. 93 faces he claims to remember from decades past. 93 lives he claims to have ended across America over nearly 4 decades. His name is Samuel Little, and in 2018 the FBI would make a chilling announcement. Samuel Little is the most prolific criminal in American history. Not Ted Bundy, not John Wayne Gacy, not Gary Ridgway. Samuel Little surpassed them all. For years, law enforcement believed they knew who America's worst offenders were. The Green River case had 49 confirmed victims. John Wayne Gacy had 33. Ted Bundy confessed to 30. These numbers were horrifying enough, but they were nothing compared to what investigators would discover about Samuel Little. 93. That's how many people Samuel Little confessed to harming between 1970 and 2005. 93 mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. 93 lives taken across 19 different states. And the most disturbing part? For decades, nobody connected the dots. Nobody realized that one man was traveling across America, leaving a trail of victims that spanned from California to Florida, from Texas to Ohio. How did he avoid capture for so long? How did he select his targets? And why did it take almost 50 years for the truth to finally emerge? Samuel Little had a method that made him nearly invisible to law enforcement. He specifically targeted vulnerable women, those struggling with substance issues, those working in dangerous situations, those living on the margins of society, women whose disappearances often went unreported, women whose cases went cold before they even got warm. He would approach them with charm, with promises, with a friendly smile. Then he would take them to isolated locations. His method of harm was particularly cruel. He would strangle his victims with his massive hands, watching them lose consciousness. But he did it in a way that left minimal physical evidence. Many deaths were ruled as accidents, overdoses, or natural causes. Some bodies were never found at all. For nearly 4 decades, Samuel Little moved through America like a ghost. Arrested multiple times for various offenses, he would serve short sentences and return to his pattern. He exploited gaps in communication between law enforcement agencies. He took advantage of a time before DNA databases and digital record-keeping. He understood that society's most vulnerable people were also the least likely to be searched for. How does someone harm 93 people and remain free for decades? What failures in our system allowed this to happen? How many of his victims are still listed as missing persons or unexplained deaths? And most haunting of all, could there be more victims that even he doesn't remember? The story of Samuel Little isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about the invisible people in our society. It's about the gaps in our justice system. It's about how evil can hide in plain sight when we're not looking in the right places. What you're about to hear is the complete story of America's deadliest criminal. From his troubled childhood to his final days in prison. From his first victim to his shocking confessions. This is a story about justice delayed, about victims finally getting their names back, and about the detectives who refused to give up until the truth came out. Samuel McDowell Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. World War II was raging overseas, and America itself was deeply divided by segregation and economic hardship. But Samuel's personal struggles would eclipse even these broader social challenges. His mother was just 16 years old when she gave birth to him. She was a teenager herself, unprepared and unwilling to care for an infant. The identity of Samuel's father remains uncertain to this day. His mother never revealed who the man was, and Samuel would grow up never knowing his paternal lineage. This absence would become one of the defining features of his psychology. Unable to care for her newborn, Samuel's mother quickly gave him to his grandmother, who would raise him in Lorain, Ohio, an industrial city on the shores of Lake Erie. His grandmother was a hard-working woman who did her best under difficult circumstances, but she was already struggling to support herself. She worked multiple jobs, cleaning houses, doing laundry, whatever work she could find to make ends meet. Growing up in the 1940s and 50s as an African-American child in industrial Ohio meant facing poverty and discrimination from an early age. But Samuel's problems went deeper than his economic circumstances. His mother drifted in and out of his life, appearing occasionally, but never establishing a real relationship with him. She would show up for a few days or weeks, making promises she wouldn't keep, then disappear again for months or years. This pattern of abandonment and inconsistency deeply scarred young Samuel. Child psychologists who would later study his case suggested that this early rejection created profound attachment issues. He learned that people were unreliable, that relationships were temporary, that emotional connections were meaningless. These lessons would shape his entire worldview and his treatment of others throughout his life. As a child, Samuel showed troubling behaviors that should have raised alarms. He was intelligent. IQ tests would later show he was of above-average intelligence. But he struggled in school, not because he couldn't learn, but because he refused to follow rules. He was defiant with teachers, dismissive of authority, and manipulative with his peers. His grandmother tried to instill discipline, but she was overwhelmed. She was working long hours just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Samuel was often left alone, unsupervised for hours or days at a time. He would later claim that he spent much of his childhood wandering the streets of Lorain, observing people, learning to read them, understanding their weaknesses. By his teenage years, Samuel had already begun getting into trouble with the law. His first arrest came when he was just 16 years old for burglary. He had broken into a neighbor's home, not just to steal valuables, but seemingly for the thrill of invasion. When questioned by police, he showed no remorse, only annoyance at being caught. He started breaking into homes regularly, developing techniques for picking locks and avoiding detection. But investigators who reviewed these early cases noticed something unusual. Samuel often didn't take the most valuable items. Sometimes he would just rearrange things, go through personal belongings, or simply sit in the homes he invaded. He would later tell investigators that he enjoyed the feeling of power it gave him, entering someone's private space without permission, being where he shouldn't be, knowing things about people they didn't know he knew. He also began showing concerning behavior toward women during his teenage years. Even as a young man, Samuel was large and physically imposing. He stood over 6 feet tall with powerful hands and a muscular build from manual labor. He learned early that he could use his size to intimidate others, particularly women and smaller men. Several incidents from his teenage years involved him following women, making them uncomfortable, crossing boundaries. There were also reports of violence. A former classmate would later recall that Samuel once got into a fight with another student and didn't stop hitting him even after the boy was unconscious. Teachers had to physically pull Samuel off. When asked why he kept hitting, Samuel reportedly said, "I wanted to see what would happen." By the time Samuel Little reached his 20s, he had already been arrested multiple times for burglary, theft, assault, and fraud. He spent short periods in jail but never faced serious consequences. The justice system of the 1960s released him again and again, never recognizing the danger he posed, never connecting his escalating pattern of behavior. In 1961, Samuel was arrested in Omaha, Nebraska, for breaking into a furniture store. He served 3 months and was released. In 1964, he faced charges for assault in Lorain, Ohio, after a violent altercation outside a bar. The charges were reduced to disorderly conduct. He paid a fine and walked free. Each arrest added to his criminal record, but nothing stuck. He was building a resume of violence and violation, but more importantly, he was learning how to work the system. He learned which stories judges believed. He learned how to appear remorseful in court while feeling nothing inside. He learned that the system had limits to its memory and its patience. During this period, Samuel also began using substances heavily, alcohol primarily, but also whatever else was available. The substances didn't cause his violence, but they removed what little inhibition he might have had. They gave him an excuse for his behavior when he was caught. They became part of his pattern. He also began living a transient lifestyle, moving from city to city, state to state, never settling anywhere for long. He would later claim that his first victim came in 1970 in Miami, Florida, though investigators believe it may have been even earlier. The truth remains uncertain because so much of his early criminal activity went undocumented or unconnected. Samuel himself couldn't remember exactly when he first took a life. The years and the victims blurred together in his mind. Samuel Little's confirmed spree of violence began in 1970, marking the start of what would become nearly 4 decades of terror across America. Though the exact date and victim remain subjects of ongoing investigation, what is known paints a chilling picture of a man who had perfected his ability to find and exploit the vulnerable. By the early 1970s, Samuel had developed a clear and calculated pattern. He was traveling constantly, using the American highway system like his personal hunting ground. He would move from city to city, state to state, never staying long enough to draw attention, never establishing routes that could later be traced. He worked odd jobs: janitor, warehouse worker, construction laborer, always cash under the table, always temporary, always forgettable. His targets were always vulnerable women. This wasn't random. This was deliberate selection based on years of observation and criminal experience. He would cruise areas known for illegal activities, looking for women who were struggling, who were desperate, whose society had already marginalized and dismissed. He knew these women were less likely to be reported missing quickly. He knew their cases would receive less attention from police. He knew that even if their bodies were found, the investigations would be cursory. He looked for women with substance dependencies, who might be willing to get into a car with a stranger for the promise of money or substances. He looked for women working in survival situations, who couldn't afford to be choosy about clients. He looked for women experiencing homelessness who might accept an offer of a warm meal or a place to sleep. These women weren't chosen because they were easy targets, though they were, but because Samuel understood that society's indifference to their lives would help him avoid detection. Samuel Little claimed that his first victim was a woman he encountered in Miami, Florida in 1970. He described her as being in her early 20s, with dark hair and a slender build. He said he met her on the street, offered her a ride, and drove her to an isolated area near the Everglades. There, he strangled her and left her body where he believed it would never be found. This case has never been definitively confirmed. No body matching his description was found. No missing person report from that time and place matches his account. But investigators believe him because his descriptions of other victims whose identities have been confirmed, are so accurate that there's no reason to doubt this claim. If true, This victim represents the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across America for 35 years. A woman approached on the street. An offer of help or companionship. A drive to an isolated location. Strangulation. A body left behind. And then Samuel moving on to the next city, the next state, the next victim. Samuel Little's approach was chillingly calculated, refined over years of practice. He would engage his victims in conversation, often posing as a friendly stranger or offering help. With his imposing physical presence, he was over 6 feet tall and weighed more than 200 pounds. He could also use intimidation when charm didn't work. He would convince or force women into his car, usually an older, unremarkable vehicle that wouldn't draw attention, then drive them to isolated locations far from where they'd been picked up. His method of causing harm was manual strangulation, but he did it in a way that demonstrated both cruelty and cunning. He would strangle his victims until they lost consciousness, but he did it slowly, methodically, using pressure points on the neck that would cause fatal harm while leaving minimal external bruising. This technique was deliberate. Samuel understood that if bodies were found, medical examiners needed to see obvious signs of violence to classify a death as suspicious. Without clear evidence of trauma, deaths might be attributed to other causes. He would later describe in interviews how he refined his technique over the years. He talked about it the way a craftsman might discuss perfecting a skill, showing no awareness of the horror of what he was describing. He explained that he learned to avoid leaving the telltale marks that obvious strangulation would create. He learned to position bodies in ways that suggested accidental death. He learned which locations made discovery unlikely. Some victims were simply left in remote areas where they wouldn't be discovered for months or years, if ever. Ravines, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, industrial zones, places where the homeless often gathered or where people wouldn't be surprised to find a body, assuming substance-related causes. Others were placed in locations where their deaths could be attributed to accidents or natural causes. A woman left near a highway might be assumed to have been hit by a car. A woman left in an area known for substance use might be assumed to have overdosed. Samuel understood that in the 1970s and 80s, communication between police departments was limited and slow. There was no national database of missing persons. There was no quick way to share information about suspicious deaths across state lines. A suspicious death in California wouldn't be connected to one in Florida unless someone specifically looked for that connection. And why would they? These seemed like isolated incidents involving marginalized women in different parts of the country years apart. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Samuel Little was essentially a nomadic predator, crisscrossing America in a decades-long rampage that left victims in nearly every region of the country. He would spend time in Los Angeles, living in cheap motels and homeless shelters, hunting in areas like South Central and Skid Row. Then he would move to Florida, working his way through Miami, Jacksonville, and Tampa. He'd travel to Ohio, returning to familiar territory around Cleveland and Lorain, then down to Texas, through Houston and Odessa and Lubbock. He worked odd jobs under the table, as a janitor cleaning office buildings at night, in warehouses loading trucks, doing manual labor on construction sites, working in bars as a bouncer where his size was an asset. These cash-based jobs kept him off official records and gave him the freedom to move without leaving a paper trail. He had no credit cards, no bank accounts, no permanent address. He existed in the cash economy, invisible to the systems that track most Americans. Between jobs, he would collect welfare benefits under various names in different states. The lack of computer systems meant that welfare fraud across state lines was nearly impossible to detect. He might be Samuel Little in California, Sam Little in Texas, Samuel McDowell in Ohio. The bureaucracies didn't communicate with each other, and he exploited every gap. He was arrested multiple times during these decades for various offenses: theft, assault, weapons charges, fraud, soliciting. But incredibly, he never faced consequences serious enough to stop his violent pattern. He would serve a few months in county jail, maybe a year in state prison, then be released to continue his activities. The criminal justice system kept giving him chances, and he kept using those chances to harm more people. Investigators would later identify victims from this period in multiple states, creating a map of violence that spanned the entire country. A woman named Patricia Parker in Mississippi in 1982, found in a wooded area, her death initially attributed to natural causes. Another victim, Rosie Hill in Marion County, Florida, in 1982, discovered near a highway. Mary Jo Brosley in Covington, Kentucky, in 1984, whose case went cold within weeks of her disappearance. In Georgia, several cases from the 1970s and 80s would later be connected to Samuel's confessions. In Tennessee and Louisiana, similar patterns emerged. Each case was investigated separately by local police departments with limited resources and no reason to suspect a connection to cases in other states. Nobody saw the pattern because nobody was looking for one across such vast geographic distances and time spans. The victims ranged in age from teenagers to women in their 50s. They came from different backgrounds, different races, different circumstances. But they all shared one thing: vulnerability. They were all women that Samuel believed society wouldn't miss, wouldn't search for, wouldn't fight for. And for decades, he was right. There were several moments when Samuel Little could have been stopped, when alert investigators or determined prosecutors could have ended his rampage decades before it actually ended. But each time, the system failed. Each time, Samuel slipped through the cracks. And each time he walked free, more women lost their lives. In 1982, he was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and charged in connection with the case of a woman named Melinda Rose LaPree, whose body had been found in a wooded area. The evidence connecting him to the case was circumstantial but significant. He had been seen with her shortly before her disappearance. Witnesses placed him in the area where her body was found. But the prosecution couldn't definitively prove he had caused her death, and he was released due to insufficient evidence. This was a turning point that wasn't taken. If prosecutors had pursued the case more aggressively, if they had the forensic tools available today, if they had connected this case to similar cases in other states, Samuel Little's story might have ended in 1982 with a dozen victims instead of 93. In 1984, he was arrested in San Diego County and charged with assault, false imprisonment, and attempt to harm 2 women. This case was even more clear-cut. The women survived and could testify about what Samuel had done to them. They described how he had picked them up, driven them to isolated areas, and attempted to strangle them. One had fought him off. The other had escaped when a passing car scared him away. But once again, the charges were either dropped or reduced through plea bargaining. Samuel served a short sentence for assault and was released. One of the women from these cases would later be identified as a near victim who escaped before he could cause her fatal harm. She was one of the lucky ones. But how many unlucky ones followed because the system let him go? In 1987, Los Angeles police arrested Samuel after a woman reported that he had assaulted her. She described being strangled and thought she was going to die. But the case fell apart when she was deemed an unreliable witness due to her background and lifestyle. The charges were dropped. Samuel walked free. Within months, another woman was found deceased in an alley in South Los Angeles. These weren't just administrative failures or bureaucratic mistakes. These were missed opportunities to save lives. Each time Samuel walked free, he returned to his pattern. And each time, more women paid the price for a system that didn't take violence against vulnerable women seriously enough. By the 1990s, Samuel Little had refined his methods to near perfection through decades of practice. He knew which areas to hunt in, the neighborhoods where vulnerable women gathered, where police presence was minimal, where witnesses were unlikely to come forward. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence, touching as little as possible, leaving bodies in positions that suggested other causes of death, selecting victims whose lifestyles made police suspicious that substances or accidents were involved. He knew which victims would draw the least attention. Women with criminal records, women estranged from their families, women whose deaths wouldn't generate media coverage or public outcry. This knowledge came from experience, from watching how police and society reacted to different cases over the years. He had become an expert in exploiting America's social fault lines. During this decade, he was particularly active in California, Ohio, and Florida, the three states where he had the strongest connections and knew the terrain best. Investigators would later confirm victims from Los Angeles, where he targeted women in South Central and around MacArthur Park. From Cleveland, where he hunted in the neighborhoods around East 93rd Street and Kinsman Avenue. From Tampa, where he found victims along Nebraska Avenue and in the neighborhoods of East Tampa. The pace of his crimes seemed to accelerate during the 1990s, perhaps because he felt invincible after evading capture for so long, perhaps because his compulsion was growing stronger and harder to control, perhaps because he simply had more opportunities as he became more practiced at identifying and isolating victims. Some years saw multiple victims in different states as he traveled the country. But age was beginning to catch up with him. By the late 1990s, Samuel was approaching 60 years old. His health was declining from decades of substance use, poor nutrition, and the stress of his transient lifestyle. Diabetes was affecting his vision and mobility. Heart disease was slowing him down. His lifestyle of constant movement was becoming harder to maintain. The pace of his crimes began to slow in the early 2000s, though he remained dangerous. His last confirmed victim was in 2005, when he was 65 years old. After that, his health deteriorated to the point where he could no longer continue his pattern of violence. But by then, the damage was done. 93 victims over 35 years, 93 lives ended, 93 families destroyed. For decades, Samuel Little's crimes went unconnected. But advances in DNA technology would finally begin to bring his past to light. In 2012, detectives in Los Angeles were working cold cases involving 3 women whose bodies had been found between 1987 and 1989. DNA evidence from these scenes had been preserved, though no matches had been found. When investigators ran the DNA through updated databases, they got a hit. Samuel Little, who was then in prison in California on a substance-related charge. The match was strong enough to warrant further investigation. Detective Mitzi Roberts of the Los Angeles Police Department began building a case. She reviewed the original crime scene reports, interviewed witnesses, and gathered new evidence. What she found suggested that these weren't isolated incidents. There might be a pattern here that nobody had previously recognized. The investigation into Samuel Little required painstaking work. Detective Roberts and her team had to connect crimes that spanned decades and crossed state lines. They had to find evidence in cases that had long gone cold. They had to track down witnesses who had moved on with their lives. In 2014, prosecutors felt they had enough evidence to charge Samuel Little with 3 counts of causing the deaths of 3 women: Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. All 3 women had been found in Los Angeles between 1987 and 1989. All 3 had been strangled. All 3 cases had gone cold until DNA technology brought them back to life. Samuel Little was arrested and charged. But at this point, investigators had no idea of the true scope of his crimes. They believed they were dealing with a man who had harmed 3 women over a 2-year period. The reality was far more horrifying. After his arrest, Samuel Little was not immediately cooperative. He maintained his innocence in the Los Angeles cases and refused to provide information about his past. But in 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland developed a strategy that would break through Samuel's defenses. Ranger Holland understood psychology. He knew that many violent offenders have a need to be recognized, to have their accomplishments acknowledged. He approached Samuel not with hostility, but with curiosity. He asked Samuel to tell his story. He listened without judgment. He let Samuel talk. And Samuel began to talk, and talk, and talk. What started as discussions about the Los Angeles cases quickly expanded into something unprecedented. Samuel Little began confessing to crimes across the country. But these weren't vague admissions. They were detailed, specific accounts that included information only the perpetrator would know. He described victims by their physical appearance. He recalled the cities where he had taken their lives. He remembered details about locations, about the clothes they wore, about the conversations they had. His memory was extraordinary and deeply disturbing. Texas Ranger Holland conducted more than 700 hours of interviews with Samuel. During these sessions, Samuel confessed to harming 93 women over 35 years. He would sketch portraits of his victims from memory, creating haunting images that investigators would later use to identify previously unknown cases. The FBI assembled a team to verify Samuel's confessions. This wasn't a simple task. Many of the cases he described had never been reported as suspicious. Bodies had been found, and deaths attributed to other causes. Some victims had never been identified at all. But as investigators checked his accounts against old records, the details matched. A woman found in a ravine in New Mexico in 1993. The case had been ruled an overdose, but Samuel's description of how he had placed her there matched the scene. A Jane Doe discovered in Mississippi in 1977. Samuel provided details about her appearance and location that aligned with the case file. One by one, cold cases began to close. Families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones finally got answers. Jane Does were given their names back. Deaths that had been attributed to accidents or natural causes were reclassified. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Samuel's confessions was his artistic ability. Despite his failing eyesight, he could sketch detailed portraits of his victims from memory. Some of these crimes had occurred 40 or 50 years earlier, yet he remembered their faces with remarkable clarity. The FBI released these sketches to the public, hoping to generate new leads and identify unknown victims. The response was overwhelming. Tips came in from across the country. Families recognized the drawings. More cases were solved. As of 2019, the FBI had confirmed 50 of Samuel's 93 confessions through matching evidence, witness accounts, and case files. They believe many of the remaining confessions are also truthful, but confirming cases from the 1970s and 80s is challenging when evidence has been lost and witnesses are deceased. Samuel Little's trial for the 3 Los Angeles cases began in 2014, before his extensive confessions. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence connecting him to the harm caused to Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. The defense argued that DNA evidence alone wasn't sufficient, that the cases were too old, that witnesses' memories couldn't be trusted after so many years. But the jury saw through these arguments. On September 25, 2014, after deliberating for just over a day, the jury found Samuel Little guilty on all 3 counts. The verdict brought some measure of justice for 3 families who had waited 27 years for answers. In November 2014, Samuel Little was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At 74 years old, with declining health, everyone knew he would spend his remaining days in prison. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of understanding the full scope of his crimes. As Samuel's confessions were verified, additional charges followed. In 2018, he was charged with the 1994 case of Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas. He pleaded guilty and received another life sentence. In Ohio, he was charged in connection with the cases of 3 women from the Cleveland area. He pleaded guilty to these charges as well, adding more life sentences to his record. Each conviction brought closure to families, but it also highlighted the tragedy of how long these cases had remained unsolved. Many of Samuel's victims had been dismissed by society, their disappearances barely investigated. Only now, decades later, were they receiving the attention and justice they deserved. Samuel Little spent his final years in a California prison, confined to a wheelchair as his health deteriorated. He suffered from diabetes and heart disease. His mobility was severely limited, but his mind remained sharp enough to continue providing details about his crimes. He gave numerous interviews from prison, speaking with journalists and documentary producers. In these interviews, he showed no remorse for his actions. He spoke about his victims in clinical terms, as if discussing objects rather than human beings. He seemed to enjoy the attention his confessions brought him. Psychologists who studied him suggested he had severe personality disorders, a complete lack of empathy, and a compulsive need for control. He saw his victims as means to satisfy his urges, not as people with lives, families, and futures. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little passed away in a California hospital at the age of 80. The cause was complications from long-term health issues. He had been serving multiple life sentences and would have remained in prison regardless of his health. His passing brought an end to one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. But for the families of his victims, his ending could never truly bring closure. Too many years had passed. Too many questions remained unanswered. Some of his 93 confessed cases remain unverified. Some victims have never been identified. Some families are still searching for loved ones who disappeared decades ago, not knowing if their missing person might be among Samuel's unnamed victims. Samuel Little's crimes expose catastrophic failures in America's justice system. He was arrested more than 100 times throughout his life for various offenses. Multiple times he was charged with crimes against women, but released due to drop charges, lack of evidence, or plea deals. The problem wasn't lack of warning signs, it was lack of follow-through. The system kept giving him chances, and each time, he used that freedom to harm more people. Perhaps the most painful lesson from this case is how society failed Samuel's victims long before he found them. These were women struggling with substance issues, women in dangerous survival situations, women experiencing homelessness. When they disappeared, their cases received minimal attention. Many of Samuel's victims were classified as runaways or assumed to have left by choice. Some deaths were quickly attributed to substances or accidents without thorough investigation. The message was clear. These lives mattered less to the system. This must change. Every missing person deserves a thorough investigation. Every unexplained ending deserves scrutiny. Every life has equal value, regardless of circumstances. Samuel Little was finally caught because of DNA technology that didn't exist during most of his criminal years. This case demonstrates why cold case units are crucial, why evidence must be preserved, and why ongoing technological advances must be applied to unsolved cases. Across America, there are thousands of cold cases sitting in evidence rooms. Some of them could be solved with modern DNA analysis. Some of them might reveal patterns that weren't visible decades ago. The work must continue. How do we prevent another Samuel Little? It starts with taking all reports of violence seriously. It continues with better communication between law enforcement agencies. It includes supporting vulnerable populations so they're less susceptible to predators. We must fund victim services, substance recovery programs, and housing assistance. We must train police to recognize patterns across jurisdictions. We must maintain and improve DNA databases. We must never dismiss a missing person report because of who that person was or how they lived. This story reminds us that justice delayed is not justice denied if we refuse to give up. Share this documentary to raise awareness about the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable. Subscribe to stay informed about cases that need our attention. And remember, staying vigilant and supporting those in need can prevent future tragedies.